Have you ever looked at a mountaintop fire and wondered what message it once carried? Long before the age of satellites and phones, when silence stretched for miles, ancient civilizations found a way to speak across the impossible, using nothing but light, smoke, and patience. In the quiet hills of China, towers once watched one another through the haze of dawn. A single spark could travel hundreds of miles, leaping from peak to peak, carrying warnings, hopes, and human connection. Tonight, we'll wander through those forgotten watchtowers, the lonely lives of the men who guarded them, the fires that saved kingdoms, and the enduring truth behind every flame that ever tried to speak. This is the Ancient Beacons, how the world's first long-distance communication was born. Settle in. Let the past burn softly in the distance. The old problem, distance itself before the written word. Before letters sealed with wax or the echo of a messenger's horse on an ancient road, there was only distance. Vast, uncertain, and full of silence. For most of human history, distance was not simply space, it was danger. A village might hear thunder, but never the cry of warning from a neighbor a few valleys away. A kingdom might fall on its borderlands, while the capital slept peacefully, unaware that enemies had already crossed the river. The space between people, between cities, between armies, between families was filled not just with land and air, but with waiting. And so, for every civilization that rose upon the earth, one ancient problem remained constant: how to speak across the silence. The age of shouting and runners and the earliest communities, the human voice was the first tool of connection. Hunters called across plains, shepherds shouted to one another across hills. But the voice could only travel so far before it broke into the wind. Then came the runner, the messenger on foot, carrying words instead of tools, breath instead of ink. These were the living threads of communication that tied ancient societies together. From the swift-footed runners of the Inca trails to the royal couriers of Persia, every message began with a human body, fragile, determined, and vulnerable to time. To send a word across distance was to gamble with chance itself. A storm, a lost road, a bandit, and a message was gone forever. Yet the need to communicate never ceased. The world was wide, but people were determined to make it smaller. When words couldn't travel fast enough, imagine a general standing on a distant frontier, hearing rumors of movement in the enemy's camp. His scouts see smoke, but no details. He needs to warn the capital, but it lies 100 miles away. By the time his messenger reaches the palace, it could be too late. Distance turned time into an enemy. A single day's delay could change the course of history. A war lost, a city burned, a dynasty ended. The farther humanity spread across rivers, deserts, and seas, the more the question grew urgent: how can we make light, sound, or even smoke carry our words faster than feet? The first experiments with the elements nature became humanity's first messenger. Wind carried shouts, light cast reflections, fire sent signs into the dark. It is easy to imagine the earliest moments of this discovery. A tribe on one hill lighting a fire at dusk, while another group on a distant ridge answers with their own flame. A wordless signal, yet full of meaning. We are safe, we see you, the hunt is done. From this simplicity came the first steps toward a universal truth, that communication did not have to be bound by the human voice. The world itself could speak, if one knew how to use it. The birth of signals across continents and ages, different peoples found the same answer: light. Fire became more than warmth, it became a symbol of connection. In the highlands of ancient China, guards lit torches to warn of raiders. In the deserts of Persia, flames linked one fortress to another. Even in the forests of early Europe, bonfires burned to guide travelers or summon warriors. Each fire was a heartbeat of civilization, a pulse of awareness. When one light appeared on the horizon, others followed, stretching across valleys and rivers like veins of flame. It was the world's first network, the emotional weight of distance. For those who lived in isolation, mountain keepers, watchtower guards, and border soldiers, the signal flame became something deeply personal. It was not just a tool of war, but a reminder that someone, somewhere, could still see them. Imagine a lone watchman on a cold wall, tending to his torch through the night. The stars wheel above him, the silence is heavy, and the nearest human voice might be miles away. Then, suddenly, a light flickers on the far ridge, distant but unmistakable. Someone is there, someone has answered. The flame carried more than information, it carried comfort. When distance became power, for kings and emperors, the ability to send messages quickly was a kind of magic and power. To know sooner was to rule stronger, to warn faster was to defend better. In this way, the ancient struggle against distance shaped entire empires. The Persians stretched lines of beacons across deserts. The Greeks placed torches on towers to send news of victory and defeat. The Chinese turned the Great Wall into a chain of light stretching beyond sight. Each system reflected the same human dream. That distance could be conquered not by force, but by cleverness. The first silent language, fire and smoke, had no words, yet they spoke through rhythm and repetition. 2 fires might mean peace. 3, danger. A burst of smoke at dawn could signal reinforcements. A column of dark smoke at midday could mean attack. Even before alphabets were born, humanity invented syntax patterns that turned nature into language. This was not speech, but signal. simple, quick, efficient, the beginning of everything from telegraphs to satellites. The fragility of connection, yet these early systems were not perfect. Rain could smother flames, fog could hide light, wind could scatter smoke, a careless signaler might miscount, and an entire army could march in the wrong direction. Even the night sky could deceive the glint of a star mistaken for a flame. Distance had been bridged, but not mastered. Still, these early attempts showed something extraordinary, that people, thousands of years ago, shared the same hunger for connection that we feel today. The human dream behind the fire. There is something deeply poetic about those early beacons. Each light represented trust that someone would see it, interpret it, and respond. A fragile bond stretched across the earth by nothing but faith and flame. And though the materials were simple, wood, smoke, and courage, the idea behind them was profound. Humans had found a way to speak without speaking, to send thought through the air, to turn distance into conversation. The same desire that drives satellites into orbit once began with a man and a torch on a lonely hill. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it. A dark horizon under ancient skies, silent except for the whisper of wind. Then, a flicker, a single light blooming into the night. And then, another, and another, a line of fire stretching from mountain to mountain, until the earth itself seems alive with signal and purpose. This was the first voice of the connected world, the beginning of humanity's long and luminous conversation across the distance. The earliest sparks smoke on the hills, long before walls rose, before armies patrolled their borders, and before kings built towers to guard the horizon. There was only the open world, vast, wild, and scattered with human lives that tried to find one another through distance and silence. People hunted and wandered across great plains, through forests and deserts, and though they shared the same earth, they often lived as if alone upon it. To speak across a valley, to call from one ridge to another, was to challenge nature itself. At first, communication meant sound, a shout, a drumbeat, the horn of an animal turned into a call. Sound could travel, but it was trapped by distance, swallowed by wind or trees, and lost in the echo of mountains. Yet the instinct to reach out, to let others know we are here, was ancient, perhaps older than civilization itself. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, a person lit a small fire on a hill. Maybe it was for warmth, maybe for cooking, but somewhere else, another saw the rising smoke and understood it as a sign. It meant something, perhaps safety, perhaps danger, perhaps simply life. And in that moment, without words or design, humanity stumbled upon its first visual language, a language written in smoke and light. The beauty of fire was that it could be seen when sound could not be heard. A thin column of smoke in daylight, a glow at night, these were messages that could leap across valleys and rivers, over forests and deserts. Fire became the first messenger that required no voice. It was language painted on the sky. Over time, the idea spread across the world in many forms. In the grasslands of Africa, hunters would burn patches of dry grass to signal a successful kill or to guide others toward a herd. In the highlands of Asia, shepherds and guards built small watchfires that could be seen from neighboring hills. In the deserts of Arabia, tribes used controlled fires to mark safe camps or warn travelers of raiders. Each community, far apart and unaware of the others, discovered the same truth, that fire could speak, and from that truth grew systems, small and simple at first. The number of smoke columns, their size, or even the rhythm of their rise could mean different things. 2 puffs might mean danger. 1 continuous stream might mean all is well. Fire was not just warmth, it was pattern. It became a pulse, a sign, a signal in the language of survival. Archaeologists have found ancient fire pits placed in deliberate patterns on hillsides, some dating back to early Bronze Age settlements. Their alignment wasn't random, they faced one another. This suggests that even early societies, without writing, understood coordination. One fire answered another, and in that answering, the world felt smaller. Picture it, a silent plain under a pale sun. The air is dry, the horizon endless. Then, far away, a thin curl of smoke rises. It bends with the wind, fading and reappearing like a ghost. A watcher on another hill sees it, and throws more dry brush onto his own fire. A second column appears, then a third, somewhere beyond the hills. And in less than an hour, what began as a single flame has become a chain, a living connection across the land. Such networks may seem primitive compared to our modern systems of instant communication, but in their time, they were miracles. They saved villages from ambush, guided travelers through wilderness, and brought news faster than any runner could. Each fire was a small triumph of intelligence, the first step in humanity's lifelong attempt to master distance. There was also poetry in these early signals. At dusk, when the world turned gold, and shadows stretched long, a single fire on a hill could appear both fragile and eternal. The people who tended these fires were not just guards or messengers, they were custodians of connection. They waited for the horizon to answer them, for another flame to confirm that they were seen. The wait must have been both lonely and comforting, a quiet trust shared across the empty land. Smoke and light became woven into ritual as well. Some fires burned, not for warning but for ceremony, smoke rising as a sign to gods or spirits. The same gesture that called for help also became a prayer. The sky became a messenger between earth and heaven, just as it carried signals from one hill to another. For ancient people, there was little difference between divine communication and human connection. Both relied on faith that someone, somewhere, would receive the message. Different cultures shaped their own methods. In the Americas, long before European arrival, indigenous peoples developed intricate smoke signal systems that could convey complex messages depending on the number, height, and frequency of smoke puffs. Some signals warned of danger, others welcomed allies. What began as a simple human instinct to use fire as a voice became refined into structured communication. In Africa, desert caravans used smoke to mark safe oases or warn of hostile camps ahead. In the islands of the Pacific, fires were lit on peaks to guide voyagers returning from the sea. Even in ancient Greece, before the age of coded torches and structured beacons, Homer's world imagined heroes sending signals of victory or distress through distant flames. The concept was universal. Everywhere humanity went, the need to be seen and understood traveled with them. These first sparks did more than send warnings. They changed how people saw the world. To light a fire on a hill and wait for an answer was to realize that the land was no longer an empty space. It was a living network. Each hill, each tower, each flame became a part of a system of trust. Civilization begins, in part, when one group of people learns how to call to another. But the language of fire was delicate. It relied on clear skies, on careful timing, and on discipline. A single misread signal could spread panic or false hope. One accidental spark, seen by tired eyes on a distant watchpost, could mean a call to arms or a false alarm. Yet people persisted, refining their methods, learning how to use color, pattern, and timing to make their signals more precise. Even then, humanity was learning the first lessons of information: clarity, reliability, and speed. When night came, the fires glowed more brightly, scattered stars upon the darkened land. Travelers who saw them from afar must have felt a strange comfort. Some were out there, others were awake, tending their fires too. The world, though vast, was suddenly connected by light. There's something deeply human about that image. The idea that long before electricity, before cables and screens, people were already sending light into the dark, hoping to be seen. Smoke and flame carried not just information but emotion, reassurance, warning, and presence. A message not of words, but of being. And so, as centuries passed, these early sparks became tradition. The art of fire signaling spread and evolved from chance discovery to deliberate system. Some would later be built into grand networks of watchtowers, some into military chains that spanned empires. But it all began here, in the simplest of gestures, a fire on a hill, and another answering it. Each flame, rising into the air, carried more than smoke. It carried hope, the hope that across the distance, someone was watching, someone was listening, someone was there. The hills would glow and fade, night after night, for thousands of years. And as humans learned to organize their signals to measure distance and time, one civilization would take this humble idea and turn it into one of the greatest systems of communication ever seen. A chain of light so vast that it could warn an empire before dawn. Fire on the Great Walls, the Chinese beacon towers. The Great Wall of China stretches like a scar of time itself. Silent, vast, winding over mountains and deserts, touching the clouds, then vanishing into haze. Today, it is a monument of stone and endurance. But long ago, it was something more than a wall. It was a messenger. It was the nervous system of an empire. For centuries, the wall was alive with light. Each of its towers, spaced across the horizon, was a station in one of the most sophisticated communication networks of the ancient world. A language of smoke by day and flame by night. Swift, precise, and powerful enough to reach the emperor's court in a single day. Imagine it, 2,000 years ago, the northern winds cutting cold through the Gobi Plain. In the watchtowers, soldiers kept silent vigil, eyes fixed on the endless steppe beyond. Somewhere in the distance dust rises, the sign of movement. Horses, perhaps, raiders from the north. One signal fire lit could warn the next tower, and then the next, until the message raced across the wall faster than any rider could carry it. The Great Wall was never a single wall. It was a system, a chain of fortresses, towers, and stations that stretched over deserts, mountains, and valleys. Its beacon towers, called Fenghuatai Fenghuatai, were the beating heart of this system. They stood upon high ridges, carefully positioned so that each one could see the next. Visibility meant survival. When one flame rose, others followed, and what began as a single light became a cascade of warning, rolling like a wave of fire across the land. In the beginning, these signals were simple. A fire meant danger. But as dynasties rose and refined their methods, the system grew more intricate. Under the Han Dynasty, the towers were manned around the clock. Soldiers were trained to recognize patterns, not just one fire, but how many were lit, and how fast. A single beacon might mean a small raiding party. 5 fires might mean a major invasion. Smoke by day, flame by night, each signal carried coded meaning. the ancient world's version of an urgent message. Each tower stored dry wood, reeds, and sulfur, ready at all times. The moment danger appeared, guards set the pile alight. The wind caught the smoke, and the next station answered. In clear weather, a warning could travel hundreds of kilometers within hours. No messenger, no letter, no horse could ever move so quickly. It was as though the empire had invented lightning in the age of iron. The system was not only practical, it was also deeply symbolic. In Chinese culture, fire was an element of transformation, a force that illuminated and purified. These towers were more than defenses. They were guardians of civilization's light. Each flame was a declaration. We are still here. The border still holds. At night, the towers glowed like stars scattered along the mountains. The Great Wall transformed into a living constellation. Soldiers stationed at each beacon must have felt both isolation and awe, the same feelings shared by their brothers miles away, staring into the same night. The flames linked them in invisible companionship, a chain of duty and endurance. But this system was not without its perils. The power of the signal lay in its speed, and its danger lay in its trust. If one tower lit its fire too soon, or in error, panic could ripple through the empire. There are stories of false alarms, where a startled guard, mistaking shadows for invaders, sent a message that drew entire garrisons into motion. In a world where one flame meant war, precision was everything. One of the most haunting tales comes from the Western Zhou period, the story of King Yu and the beacon prank. Legend says the king had a beautiful but silent queen who rarely smiled. To amuse her, the king lit the warning beacons without cause, tricking his nobles into rushing to the capital. When they arrived and found no danger, the queen laughed for the first time. But when real invaders came soon after, no one answered the fire, and the kingdom fell. A grim reminder that the power of signal depended on belief. Once trust was broken, even fire lost its voice. Still, through centuries, the beacon towers endured. Dynasties changed, but the watchfires remained, flickering on mountain ridges through every age. Qin, Han, Tang, Ming, with every empire came reconstruction, expansion, refinement. The towers grew taller, the spacing more calculated, and the guards more disciplined. Some towers were built from stone and brick, others from rammed earth and wood. Inside, narrow stairways led up to the signal platforms, where piles of fuel waited beneath protective canopies. In some regions, mixtures of wolf dung were burned, chosen for their thick, dark smoke, visible even in daylight. It was not beauty they sought, but visibility. The smoke had to rise high, dark against the pale sky, a banner of urgency carried by the wind. There is something almost poetic about how the empire used nature itself as messenger. The sky as its parchment, the fire as its ink. In that flickering dance of flame and smoke was written the language of survival. At its height, during the Han Dynasty, the system was so effective that an attack on the western frontier could be reported to the capital Chang'an in just a few hours. Over to millennia before telegraphs or radio, messages traveled at the speed of sight. Civilization had discovered the art of light-speed communication. But beyond the practical marvel, there is a quiet human story. The men who kept these fires, stationed far from home, they lived among the stones and stars, their days marked by silence, and their nights by the duty of watching. Their lives depended on readiness, the ability to notice the faintest movement in the dark horizon, and to respond without hesitation. In the stillness of those mountain posts, they must have found a kind of meditative rhythm. The waiting, the watching, the eternal vigil. The flicker of flame was both their companion and their purpose. To them, a single signal was not just a task, it was life itself, the proof that their lonely tower mattered to the empire's vast body. When the fires were lit, they stood in the glow, watching their signal leap to the next hill, then the next, a river of flame flowing across the night. The feeling must have been overwhelming, almost holy, to witness connection made visible, to know that their action, their small tower, was part of something immense. Today, the remains of those beacon towers still stand, crumbling and silent, scattered along the spine of the Great Wall. Many are forgotten, buried beneath centuries of dust, their fires long extinguished. Yet if you walk there at dusk, when the wind is still and the horizon turns red, you can almost imagine the ancient light returning, one spark on a ridge, then another, until the mountains burn again in silent conversation. Those flames once carried messages of fear and urgency, but they also carried the essence of communication itself, the wish to be understood, the need to be seen. Each fire was a heartbeat of civilization, pulsing through darkness. The Great Wall's beacons remind us that progress doesn't always begin with invention. Sometimes, it begins with imagination. The idea that light could be turned into language, that distance could be bridged, not by strength, but by understanding. In the quiet glow of those ancient fires, humanity glimpsed its future. Every signal that blazed along the wall was not just a warning, but a whisper of what would come, from torches to telegraphs, from light to radio, from the hills of China to the satellites above us. The same dream has never died, to send a message faster than time itself. The language of smoke and flame in the stillness between mountains, smoke once spoke. It rose into the air like a living sentence, curling, stretching, vanishing, carrying meaning across the horizon. To the ancients, this was not mere fire. It was communication, crafted through discipline, intention, and the understanding of pattern. Before words traveled by ink, they traveled by flame. The beacon towers of China were not just guardians of borders, they were teachers of a new kind of language. The soldiers who tended them were both watchers and messengers, fluent in a code that was never written down but burned into the night sky. Each puff of smoke, each burst of flame, had its own purpose. To modern eyes, the rising column might look random, but to trained men along the frontier, it was as clear as a spoken command. This was not chaos, but syntax, not light, but language. The dawn of signal codes when the Han Dynasty solidified the northern frontier. The empire faced a challenge. Vast distances, riders took days to deliver a message. The enemy could strike and vanish long before word reached command. To solve this, the ancient engineers of war invented meaning through pattern. At first, the system was simple. One fire meant trouble, two meant great danger. But with time, complexity grew. By the Tang Dynasty, the signals became structured. Different materials were burned for different messages, dry reeds for quick, short bursts of smoke, damp wood for long, heavy plumes, wolf dung for thick black smoke that lingered in the sky. This evolution turned fire into vocabulary. The watchers learned to distinguish how the smoke rose, tall or spreading, pale or dark, quick or constant. Just as tone can change meaning in speech, so could timing and texture in smoke. When night came, fire took the stage. Flames replaced smoke, and coded fires burned in deliberate rhythm. The number of flames, the order of ignition, and even the pauses between them carried information. A tower might light 3 quick fires followed by one long one, a sign that the enemy approached from the northwest, perhaps in smaller numbers. It was an ancient form of binary, centuries before telegraph wires crossed continents. The art of seeing and timing, what made the system work was not the fire, it was vision. Every tower had to be placed precisely, not too near, not too far. Too close, and the signals blended into confusion. Too far, and they disappeared into mist or dust. Ancient engineers measured sightlines through trial and topography, learning to read the land the way poets read silence. Timing was everything. The man who lit the fire could not delay. Hesitation meant death, but he also could not rush. He had to watch, confirm, then act. The light had to be seen by the next tower, and that tower had to respond like echoes rippling through stone. Imagine the rhythm. The first tower sees danger, raises its flame. The second sees it, lifts its own. The third answers, and the fourth, until light ripples across mountains like a heartbeat. Within minutes, news that once took days traveled from one end of the wall to the other. This rhythm was humanity's first synchronization, a chain of thought, a network of eyes. The human side of the code, but what of the men who learned this strange language of fire? They were not poets, nor scholars, but they held one of the most precise forms of communication the world had yet known. Each signaler memorized his instructions. He knew the difference between raiders sighted and enemy approaching, between send reinforcements and all clear. His mistakes could mean chaos. His precision could save lives. And in that endless waiting, through long seasons of wind and cold, the signalers found strange companionship in the rhythm of their duty. They could not speak across the miles, yet they conversed through light. To see the answering flame from the next tower was reassurance. Not only that the message had been received, but that someone was there, another pair of eyes, another soul in the vastness. In a world of distance, fire was both message and comfort. Sometimes, when there was no danger, the towers would send test signals, brief flickers of smoke to check alignment and readiness. A simple ritual, like saying, "I am here." It was a primitive form of connection, and yet, deeply human. The philosophy behind the flame, the Chinese understood something profound about communication, that it begins not with words, but with attention. To see clearly, to wait patiently, to respond precisely, these were as important as the fire itself. Their system turned nature into medium. The air became a canvas, the fire a brushstroke. Messages were ephemeral, yet they carried the weight of command. When smoke curled into the blue, it wasn't just matter rising, it was meaning made visible. The philosophy behind it reflected the harmony central to ancient Chinese thought, balance between heaven, earth, and humanity. The signaler stood at the border between them, lighting fire, a gift from earth, sending it into the sky, the realm of heaven, to carry the will of man. Echoes of light across empires, though perfected in China, this idea was not theirs alone. Across the ancient world, the same insights sparked in different minds. The Greeks lit beacon chains to announce the fall of Troy, the Persians used mountain fires to send royal orders across their empire. The Romans, too, adapted the art, refining it with torches and mirrors. Yet China took it further than any, not as isolated experiments, but as an empire-wide infrastructure. It was not the invention of the fire that mattered, but its organization. The Chinese did not merely send messages, they built a language of light that lasted for centuries, sustained through dynasties, perfected through patience. The quiet legacy. When you stand before a ruined beacon tower today, silent, sun-cracked, forgotten, it's hard to imagine that this mute pile of stones once spoke with light. But if you close your eyes and let the wind move through your thoughts, you can almost see it, the rising smoke, the shimmering flame, the answering glow far away. That was humanity's first wireless connection, the spark of an idea that would echo across time. Centuries later, when inventors like Claude Chappe built optical telegraphs in Europe, they followed the same logic, a chain of stations, each repeating the signal of the last. When Samuel Morse sent his first electric message, he used the same rhythm, short and long, pause and pulse. The ancients had already dreamed it, they had already built it, with nothing but wood, fire, and sky. In the language of smoke and flame, humanity first whispered the possibility of instant connection. It was the poetry of necessity, a communication system born from danger, but destined to shape civilization. So when we send a message today, a text, a signal bouncing off satellites, we are not far from those old watchmen on the walls. We still speak in flashes of light, only faster. We still reach through distance, through silence, seeking to be seen, to be understood. Our fires are smaller now, contained in glass and electricity, but the meaning remains the same. Echoes beyond China. The ancient world's fire networks long before wires hummed with electricity and voices crossed oceans. The first global network was made not of cables, but of light. From the deserts of Persia to the cliffs of Greece, from the coasts of Rome to the islands of the Aegean, fire became the messenger that bound empires together. Each culture, in its own age, looked up at the horizon and wondered the same thing. How can we speak to those beyond the hills? The answer came not in words, but in brightness. The ancient impulse to turn flame into meaning. The fire that announced the fall of Troy in the quiet mythology of Greece. There is a story that feels almost modern, a story not of gods or heroes, but of signal transmission. When the city of Troy finally fell, it was not a herald who brought the news to Greece. It was fire. According to the ancient tragedian, Aeschylus, Queen Clytemnestra of Mycenae was the first to know that Troy had been destroyed. Because she saw the distant flare of beacons leaping from one mountain top to another, the Greeks had devised a chain of fire stations, stretching hundreds of kilometers from Mount Ida, near Troy, across the islands of the Aegean, through Lemnos, Athos, and beyond, until it reached Argos on the Greek mainland. One flame was enough to begin the message. In a single night, the news of victory crossed the sea, a journey that would have taken ships weeks. For ancient audiences, it was miraculous. For us, it was prophetic, a glimpse of the world to come, when light itself would carry information faster than any man could run. Persia's empire of light, but the Greeks were not the first to dream of it. Far to the east, centuries earlier, the Persian Empire had already transformed fire into order. The Persians ruled one of the largest realms in history, stretching from Egypt to India. Their strength lay not only in armies or wealth, but in communication. They built an immense road system, with relay stations for horses and messengers. Yet even those swift couriers could not match the speed of the sky. Along Persia's royal road, from Sardis to Susa, beacon towers stood guard. Each one was placed where the next could see its flame. When danger arose, or when royal commands needed to travel swiftly, the watchmen would light their fires, and the signal would leap across mountains and plains. To the Persians, fire was sacred, a divine element in the worship of Ahura Mazda. Their temples held eternal flames, symbols of truth and purity. So it was fitting that their empire would use the same element, not just for worship, but for communication. Every signal, in a sense, was a prayer of governance, light carrying order into darkness. Rome and the mirrors of the West then came Rome, a civilization of roads, legions, and logic. Where others had relied on smoke and fire, the Romans sought precision. They built watchtowers along their frontiers in Gaul, in Britain, across the Rhine and Danube. Some burned torches as signals, but others experimented with something new. Heliographs, sunlight reflected by polished metal mirrors. On clear days, these glints of light could be seen for miles, flashing like coated stars across the hills. When the sun set, torches replaced mirrors. The Romans used shields, lanterns, and even pairs of shutters to control light. Early ancestors of Morse code. A Roman historian named Polybius described one such method in detail. Two operators each had matching grids of letters. One raised and lowered torches in a specific sequence to indicate columns and rows, spelling out actual words through light. It was, in essence, the world's first optical telegraph. Rome's legions used it to coordinate across battlefronts, moving as one even when separated by valleys and rivers. It turned warfare into something synchronized, an orchestra of soldiers responding to distant flares of command. To think, centuries before the telegraph key clicked its rhythm, Roman soldiers were already reading signals from light itself. Across the sands, Egypt's desert fire lines, even the deserts spoke in fire. Ancient Egyptians built beacon systems across the Sinai, linking mining outposts, fortresses, and trade routes. Their signals, often fueled by palm wood or resin, carried both warning and direction, guiding caravans through the vast emptiness. For travelers who risked the desert's silence, those distant glows were lifelines. In a world without compasses, a signal fire was not just a message, it was orientation, proof that civilization was near. Imagine a lone merchant in the endless night, seeing a small flicker far away, knowing he was not lost, not yet forgotten. The Mediterranean's web of light. As centuries passed, the coasts of the Mediterranean became a tapestry of beacons. Greek islands, Roman harbors, Phoenician trade cities, all used fire to connect across the sea. Some towers served as lighthouses for ships, others as military warning systems. At times, the same beacon could serve both, a symbol of welcome and a sign of alarm. To see a light on the horizon was to ask, is it friend or foe? In the calm of peace, the fires guided sailors home. In the tension of war, the same towers lit to summon fleets and armies. Parallel inventions, shared humanity. What is most beautiful about these ancient systems is that they were independent, yet united by need. No one culture taught another. Each civilization, standing before the same challenge, found the same solution. Light as language. From China's Feng Hua Tai to Greece's mountain fires, from Persia's sacred flames to Rome's mirrors, every empire, in its own way, discovered that distance could be conquered not by force, but by vision. It's a reminder that human innovation often blossoms in isolation, yet leads to the same truth. Wherever people have watched the horizon, they have tried to speak across it. The fragility of flame, yet all these systems shared one weakness. The fragility of fire itself. A sudden storm, a thick fog, or a careless hand could silence the entire chain. A message could vanish into smoke before reaching its next watcher. Empires learned that even the brightest light can be lost to darkness, and yet they never stopped trying. For in every beacon, there was a kind of faith that someone, far away, was watching, that the message would be seen, understood, and answered. That simple faith has never left us. Every glowing screen, every pulse of a satellite, every digital signal today carries the same ancient hope that light will bridge the gap between minds. The last fires, when Rome fell, when Persia crumbled, when Greece grew quiet, the great networks of flame went dark. Towers collapsed. Watchmen left their posts. But now and then, even centuries later, travelers would find the ruins of old stations, blackened stones on ridges, their fires long cold. Standing there, they would sense something, not the past, but the memory of connection. The thought that once, this lonely hilltop was alive with purpose. That here, once, men and flames spoke the same universal tongue. A silent heritage, though forgotten, these systems left a deep imprint on civilization. They taught us the power of repetition, precision, and relay the concept that messages could leap from point to point, across space and time. Without them, the optical telegraphs of the 18th century, the electric wires of the 19th, and the radio towers of the 20th might never have come to be. The ancients didn't know it, but they were already building the world's first network, one of vision, cooperation, and light. The fires burned out long ago, but their logic never did. The Watchers of the Flames lives behind the signals when we imagine the great systems of the ancient world. Walls that span mountains, towers that pierce the sky, fires that speak across distance. It's easy to forget the people who made them live. The unseen hands. The quiet watchers. The men who kept the flames. Every empire that used light as language relied on them. Soldiers, sentinels, servants of silence. They were the eyes and ears of civilizations, yet their names were almost never recorded. History remembers kings and inventors, but not the men who, night after night, kept the watchfires burning. In their solitude they created one of humanity's first networks, not of technology, but of attention. They were the Watchers of the Flames. The life of a signal keeper was not one of glory, it was a life of waiting. Hours, days, weeks, watching the horizon, memorizing the shapes of hills, learning the difference between storm, smoke, and enemy dust. At dawn, they woke before the light touched the towers. They checked the fuel bundles of dry reeds, stacks of wood, piles of dung carefully stored beneath cloth to keep it dry. They cleaned the signal pit, swept away old ash, and repaired the ladders and platforms that the wind had worn down. They knew that a single misstep, a fire too damp, a flame too dim, a signal too slow, could unravel the whole chain. By midday, the sun would blaze upon the stone, and the men would retreat to the shaded corners of their towers. They shared small meals, dried meat, rice, tea when available. Some carved messages into the wood or stone, short poems, names of families far away, fragments of thought carried by loneliness. Then came the long hours of stillness, the time of watching. Most days nothing happened. The horizon remained empty, the plains silent, but they could never relax. One faint movement could mean everything. To pass the time, they studied the world around them, the patterns of clouds, the rhythm of the wind, the way light changed across the valley. In those details they found signs and omens, hints of what might come. They became masters of patience, artists of stillness. When the sun began to fall, the tower stirred again. Evening was the most dangerous time, when the shadows could hide both man and message. Fires were prepared, but not yet lit. The men waited for the command. Sometimes, it never came. Sometimes, it came too soon. And then, once in a lifetime perhaps, it came in the form of panic. A cry from the wall, a horn echoing through the hills, the rush of footsteps, and the order to light the beacon. They would move with trained precision. One man would strike the tinder, another would fan the first flame, a third would add the dry reeds. The fire would roar to life, leaping into the dusk, a column of orange and red, smoke curling upward like a living creature. They would stand back, shielding their faces from the heat, watching as the next tower answered, then the next, until the whole horizon shimmered with light. In those rare moments, they were no longer alone. The watchers were bound together by light, invisible comrades connected through distance. When the fire burned low, they would add more fuel until the message had been carried on. Then came silence again. The world returned to darkness, the stars reappeared, and the men resumed their waiting. Each watcher lived between two realities: the physical isolation of the tower and the invisible connection of the network. Some were stationed for years without returning home. Their lives were measured in fires, in the rhythm of the beacons, not in seasons or festivals. Letters from home came rarely, if ever. Many were illiterate, yet they carried their memories like secret messages, replaying them during the long nights of wind and cold. When they looked at the stars, they saw the same constellations their families saw, small points of light scattered across darkness, like the towers themselves. Perhaps that thought comforted them, that they too were part of a constellation. In some regions, especially along the Great Wall of China, watchers developed their own traditions. They left offerings of food at the base of the tower for protection. They carved names into the bricks, sometimes their own, sometimes those of lost comrades. A few left poems written in charcoal, reflections on the quiet, the loneliness, the endless waiting. One ancient soldier wrote, "The wind knows my face better than my mother. The fire knows my name better than my child." No one ever recorded who he was, but his words survive, like a whisper carried through smoke. There were moments of terror too, when enemy scouts crept close, when storms tore through the mountains, when lightning struck a signal pit, and fire turned from servant to destroyer. Some watchers died at their posts, burned by their own morning fires or struck by the collapse of weakened towers. Others vanished into the wilderness, their posts overtaken by silence. Yet replacements always came. The system endured, because it had to. Empires depended on their vigilance. A single missed signal could mean the fall of a fortress, the loss of an army, the destruction of a city. The watchers were the thin thread that held together vast territories, and still, no statues were ever built for them, no names were sung. Their work was not meant to be celebrated. It was meant to be trusted. Imagine standing there with them on a cold night. The wind cuts through your clothes. The fire flickers low, throwing orange light across the stone. You look toward the next hill, and there it is, a faint glow answering you. Someone is there, another watcher, awake like you. You lift your torch slightly, and in the distance, his flame wavers, a tiny gesture of recognition, silent but understood. You don't know his name, you will never meet him, but you both serve the same purpose: to keep the chain alive. There is something profoundly human in that connection, without closeness, duty without recognition, faith without reward. Perhaps this is why these systems lasted for centuries. They relied not just on engineering, but on discipline, on human endurance. In some regions, families of watchers passed their posts down through generations. Fathers trained sons to read the horizon, to prepare fuel, to light and guard the flame. It became a lineage, a craft. Their loyalty was not only to empire, but to tradition, the quiet heritage of vigilance. Others were conscripts, soldiers assigned to remote posts as punishment or test of endurance. For them, the tower was exile. And yet, even they came to understand the strange dignity of their duty. One Chinese proverb from the Tang era says, "A soldier who guards the fire guards the kingdom's breath." It was both poetic and true. For centuries, the empire's life pulsed through those fires. Each beacon was a heartbeat, each watcher, a cell in the body of the realm. The watchers also shaped the rhythm of time itself. When no signals came for months, the men learned to measure days by the changing colors of the hills, by the movement of stars, by the song of crickets. They lived in an eternal twilight of waiting. Some wrote small diaries, hidden beneath stones, fragments that survive even now. One such note, found in a ruined tower near the Gansu corridor, reads, "5 nights, no wind. The smoke will rise straight, the moon is full. No riders seen, I hear wolves far off. We are 5 men now, that is all. No names, no dates, just the quiet record of endurance." Their lives were simple, but in that simplicity lay something timeless, the same discipline that drives every communicator across history: to watch, to listen, to respond. When we think about communication today, satellites, fiber optics, instant messages, it's easy to forget that all of it began with people like them. People who waited in silence, watching for a sign of light. They were the first nodes in the great network of humanity, the first operators of the world's invisible web, and though their fires are long gone, the spirit of their work lives on every time we send a signal into darkness, trusting that someone, somewhere, will receive it. Their legacy is not in monuments, but in the simple act of connection. The Watchers were not just guardians of borders, they were guardians of meaning. Their story reminds us that communication is not just technology. It is patience, attention, and faith, the belief that even in silence, we are not alone. The spark of progress, when light learned to travel the world of the Watchers, had lasted for centuries. The smoke and fire had served empires well, a simple language of urgency, a chain of light across distance. But time, like the wind, never stands still. Even as those towers stood against the sky, somewhere else in the world, a new idea was taking shape. Humanity was beginning to understand that communication could be more than a warning. It could be knowledge itself, moving faster than the feet that carried it. Light had already been a messenger. Now it was learning to travel with purpose. It began with curiosity, the ancient and unending kind. How could a signal become more than a sign of danger? Could it carry detail, intention, even emotion? Across deserts and mountains, merchants, soldiers, and scholars all faced the same problem: how to send meaning farther than the human voice could reach. The Chinese had their smoke and beacon systems. The Greeks had their torch relays. But beyond them, other civilizations were experimenting with light itself, bending, reflecting, and shaping it. In the sunlit lands of the Mediterranean, an old craft began to stir again: the use of mirrors. Long before the telescope or the lens, ancient people discovered something quietly miraculous: that light, when caught upon polished bronze or obsidian, could be thrown across vast distances. It began as curiosity, perhaps as play. Children on a bright day might have noticed the dance of a reflection across a wall or a river. But to thinkers of the ancient world, this was more than amusement. It was a language waiting to be born. In Greece, stories tell of soldiers on mountain tops flashing sunlight to their allies far away. A silent signal, a gleam of warning. By the time of the philosopher Aeneas Tacticus in the 4th century BCE, these flashes had become something more systematic. Aeneas described a device: 2 jars of water, each with a floating rod marked with letters or phrases. When the jars were opened at the same time, water would drain. And as the level dropped to the same point in both jars, the operators would flash mirrors to indicate specific messages. It was primitive, yes, but it was patterned. It was language made of light. The idea was simple but revolutionary: that information could move faster than a horse, faster than a man, faster even than sound. For the first time, humans were thinking about speed, not as travel, but as transmission. Light, pure, weightless, immediate, was the perfect messenger. And though these systems were fragile, requiring perfect timing and clear weather, they planted a seed in the human imagination, that the air itself could carry our words, if only we could teach it how. Elsewhere, in North Africa and the Middle East, the same truth revealed itself through the sun. The Egyptians, who had long worshipped the light, understood reflection instinctively. Their temples were designed to capture the dawn, to direct it down corridors and precise beams. In the right hands, these beams became messages of devotion, but perhaps also messages of signal. There are records from later periods suggesting that desert watchmen used polished metal mirrors to alert distant caravans, not just as warnings, but as greetings, or confirmations that water and safety awaited. The desert is a harsh teacher, and it taught one of the first great truths of communication: the value of visibility. A single flash could mean life or death. Back in China, the evolution took another form. By the Han Dynasty, the beacon systems were not only warning networks, they had become instruments of coordination. Officials began to modify the brightness, the color, even the rhythm of the flames. Some burned animal dung for dark smoke, others used oil for bright light. They discovered that variation itself could carry meaning. This realization that information could be encoded changed everything. Now, a signal was not just a shout in the dark. It was a sentence, a command, a coded rhythm. 1 column of smoke meant an alert, 2 meant movement, 3 meant invasion. Later, combinations of smoke and fire created whole sets of meaning. Simple, yes, but astonishingly effective. It was, in its essence, the birth of binary, the primitive ancestor of every digital system we use today. Imagine the sight of it: the line of towers stretching over mountains, each one sparking to life in turn, the message leaping like a pulse of light across the land. From one horizon to another, across 700 miles of wilderness, the empire spoke to itself in flame and shadow. The Watchers no longer merely guarded borders, they now transmitted thought. In those fleeting seconds between the rise of one flame and the next, an idea, a command from a distant capital crossed a kingdom, and though no one at the time could have understood it, this was the first glimpse of the modern world. Centuries later, in the rugged lands of the Mediterranean again, another people rediscovered this rhythm. The Byzantines, their empire too, stretched across vast distances, vulnerable to attack, and like the Chinese, they turned to light. They built a line of beacon towers across Asia Minor, connecting Constantinople with the eastern frontier. When danger arose, when Arab raiders approached or border outposts fell, the first tower would ignite its flame. Within minutes, the next would answer, and the next. In a single night, The emperor in his palace could know what was happening hundreds of miles away. It was an empire held together, not by roads or walls, but by light itself. And so, throughout the ancient world, the idea of communication became untethered from presence. The message no longer required the messenger. A man could send his thought into the distance without moving from his post. Something profound shifted in the human mind. Until then, speed belonged to the body, to runners, horses, ships, and wind. Now it belonged to symbols, two flashes of meaning carried by fire, smoke, and reflection. This was not just technological progress, it was psychological evolution. It taught humanity that connection could exist across absence, that we could bridge separation not through closeness, but through pattern. In that, the ancient systems were not so different from our own. When we look back now at the mirror flashes of Aeneas, at the coded beacons of the Han, at the Byzantine fire towers glowing across the mountains, we are seeing the earliest prototypes of something we now take for granted: instant communication. The same impulse that made a watchman light his torch now makes us send a message across continents in a blink. The tools have changed, the longing has not. Humanity has always sought to conquer distance, not just with movement, but with meaning. But progress never rests. As centuries turned and empires rose and fell, the idea of rapid communication continued to smolder like a hidden ember, waiting to be reignited. In time, new materials, new lenses, and new minds would rediscover what the ancients had glimpsed, that light could be not only seen, but shaped. Mirrors would become lenses. Smoke would give way to electricity, and the flicker of ancient fire would transform into the pulse of the telegraph and the spark of the wire. But all of that still lay in the distant future. For now, the world was still half shadow, half light, a place where fire was both language and mystery. And in the silence between those ancient beacons, something else was being born. The idea of innovation itself. The restless human habit of asking, what if there's a faster way? Messages in the dark, the code of fire and smoke, long before the hum of wires and the glow of screens. There was a quieter kind of communication, one that belonged to the elements. Fire, smoke, wind. It was a language born of necessity, sculpted by danger, and carried by the sky itself. And it had one purpose: to turn isolation into connection. The watchers of the beacons, the keepers of the mirrors, the builders of towers, all of them shared this secret craft. They were the first coders of history, shaping patterns in smoke and light to mean something more than what they appeared to be. This chapter is about that code, the hidden syntax of the ancient world. To understand it, imagine yourself standing in an open valley at dusk. The air is still. Far to the east, a thin column of smoke rises against the fading sun, straight, dark, deliberate. To anyone else, it might look like a fire left unattended, but to the trained eye, it is a word. Maybe it means enemy sighted, maybe it means all clear, or maybe it has something more complex, a prearranged signal only the chain of watchers would understand. These ancient systems were not just visual, they were linguistic. Every pattern of light or smoke meant something specific, chosen through careful coordination and centuries of refinement. The genius of it lies in its simplicity. The earliest codes were basic: 1 flame for peace, 2 for danger, 3 for attack. But soon, necessity demanded nuance. The Chinese, for instance, developed systems that combined smoke by day and fire by night, creating a 24-hour network of alerts. By the time of the Han Dynasty, these codes could describe not only the presence of an enemy, but the size of their army, the direction of their movement, and even their type of weapons. A single smoke column might mean cavalry approaching. 2 quick bursts could mean infantry in large numbers. At night, flames might burn with different brightness, each variation carrying its own meaning. Some sources even suggest that special fuels were used to alter the color or thickness of smoke, giving more depth to the code. This was, in essence, the birth of data compression, turning complex messages into brief, efficient signals. The Greeks, too, understood the value of encoding. In the Hellenistic world, a pair of innovators named Cleoxenus and Democritus, later refined by Polybius, a historian and thinker, designed a remarkable system using torches to represent letters. It was called the Polybius square. Imagine a 5x5 grid, each cell containing a letter. By raising 2 torches to specific positions, one for the row, one for the column, a message could be spelled out, letter by letter. It was slow, yes, but it allowed the Greeks, for the first time, to send specific words, not just general alerts. It was an enormous leap forward, the first time humans encoded language into light. This same concept, pairing positions to represent letters, would later inspire early cryptography and even digital communication centuries later. The Polybius system, in its simplicity, was both signal and cipher. In the East, similar progress was unfolding. The Chinese Song dynasty expanded the old smoke systems into more organized, military-controlled networks. They built towers at regular intervals, sometimes as close as 20 miles apart, and recorded detailed manuals describing which kind of smoke to send and when. One manual described a system where 1 smoke column meant fewer than 500 enemy troops, 2 columns meant 1,000, 3 columns meant 5,000 or more. There were even codes to indicate if enemy forces were on horseback or foot, and whether they were advancing or retreating. This was not mere signaling, it was information management. Each watchtower was like a primitive server, receiving, interpreting, and transmitting data along the chain. The efficiency was astonishing. A message could travel hundreds of miles in just a few hours. If we think of the modern internet as a web of nodes and routers, these towers were its earliest ancestors, glowing and smoking beneath the stars. But the beauty of this system lay not only in its engineering, it lay in its rhythm. To master the code of fire and smoke was to learn patience, precision, and trust. Every watcher knew that a single mistake could twist meaning into disaster. Too much wind could blur a message, too little light could hide it. A cloud could delay transmission for hours. And so, the watchers developed rituals, almost spiritual habits of timing and attention. They observed the wind's direction before each signal, studied the air's humidity, even prayed to the sky for clarity. They learned that communication was not just invention, but cooperation between man and nature, between mind and flame. In other parts of the world, similar languages of smoke were born independently. Among the indigenous tribes of North America, smoke signals became a form of social and spiritual communication, not just warning. They were used to announce gatherings, share news of hunts, mark births or deaths, and call for help. Each tribe had its own dialect of smoke, a kind of cultural code passed down through generations. One long column might mean we are safe. Several short bursts might mean we are moving. 2 quick puffs could mean all is well. These were not military signals, but communal ones, the language of families, tribes, and wanderers. To the untrained eye, it was just smoke. To those who knew, it was a conversation across the horizon. What unites all of these ancient systems is not their material, whether smoke, fire, or mirror, but their intention. They all sought to overcome one of humanity's oldest fears, the fear of silence. To live in the ancient world was to live surrounded by distance, mountains, deserts, seas, forests. To know what was happening beyond one's sight was nearly impossible. Fire and smoke changed that. They gave shape to absence. They made the invisible visible. For the first time in history, humans could send a message to people they could not see, and know that it would arrive. That realization, the moment we understood that distance could be bridged by imagination, was the birth of the modern mind. Of course, these systems had their limits. Clouds, storms, and nightfall could disrupt them. Sometimes a chain would break, a tower left unmanned, a watcher asleep, a fire too damp to catch. Miscommunication could spark chaos. One mistaken flame might send an army marching to war for no reason at all. But the world accepted these risks because the reward was far greater. For the first time, an empire could see itself, a living body connected by lines of fire, breathing through its towers. And beyond empire, these codes shaped something more profound, our sense of continuity. The knowledge that we could send our thoughts farther than our voices could reach gave birth to the very idea of permanence, that messages could outlast the messenger. It was, in its way, the first whisper of immortality. The watchers became both priests and scientists, tending not only to flames, but to meaning itself. They knew the language of shadows, they knew how to turn something as fleeting as smoke into something as lasting as truth. They were, perhaps unknowingly, creating the foundation for every network that would follow: telegraphs, radio, fiber optics, all rooted in the same principle, the transmission of pattern across space. And the more humanity practiced it, the more refined it became. Soon, we began to realize that if light and smoke could carry messages, then so could anything that moved in rhythm, sound, pulse, vibration. The code of fire and smoke was only the beginning. By the end of the ancient world, these systems had grown intricate enough to rival small cities in organization. Some had dedicated keepers for smoke, and others for flame. Some had instruments to control the size and shape of smoke columns early, modulators. Though no one would have used the term, the watchers began to keep written records of their signals, noting dates and patterns. In doing so, they created the world's first communication logs, the ancestors of the modern message archive. And though none of them could have foreseen it, they were laying down the principles that would guide human communication forever. Encode information, transmit through rhythm, preserve meaning through distance. That is the entire architecture of modern technology, written first in the language of fire. When night fell and the beacons burned low, the watchers would sometimes sit in silence, staring into the embers. The world around them was vast and dark, but they knew they were part of something greater, a network of minds, breathing together in light and smoke. The horizon itself seemed alive, pulsing with purpose. They didn't know it, but they were watching the first version of the connected world, not made of circuits and code, but of hope and flame. Their messages are gone now, their codes forgotten, but in every flash of light across a modern city, in every message that crosses oceans in an instant, a small part of their legacy lives on. Because in the end, we are still doing what they did, reaching across distance, sending meaning into the dark, and trusting that somewhere, someone will see the signal and understand. Lines of light, the first networks of the world. There is a moment in history when invention becomes something more than a tool. when it becomes an idea that reshapes the way people see the world. The creation of the first communication networks was one of those moments. The watchers had learned to send fire from tower to tower. The coders had learned to give meaning to smoke. But now, the world itself was beginning to realize that a chain of signals could become something far greater, a living web, an invisible structure that connected cities, armies, and empires together. This is the story of how humanity, centuries before telegraphs or electricity, built its first networks of information, lines of light that tied the ancient world together. It began, as so many great inventions do, with war. Empires have always feared distance. The further the borders stretched, the harder it became to control them. Messages took weeks, sometimes months, to reach a frontier. By the time orders arrived, the situation had already changed. So the rulers of early civilizations searched for a way to stretch their voices across time and space, and they found it in the rhythm of fire. From the mountains of China to the deserts of Persia, from the islands of Greece to the hills of Anatolia, empires built chains of towers, each was visible to the next, a link in a vast line of sight. When danger came, one tower would burn its signal, and within minutes, that light would travel hundreds of miles, leaping from one mountaintop to another, faster than any messenger could ride. It was, in its way, the first internet, a network built of light and trust. The Great Wall of China was perhaps the grandest of these networks. Stretching for thousands of miles, it was more than a wall. It was a nervous system. Each section had its own watchtowers, signal stations, and command posts. From the highest peaks, you could trace the line of beacons as far as the eye could see, glowing faintly against the horizon like a string of stars fallen to earth. When an enemy appeared, the first outpost would send a smoke signal by day or light a fire by night. The next tower, seeing it, would repeat the signal. Within hours, news of an invasion could reach the capital itself. It was said that during the Han Dynasty, a message could travel over 700 miles in a single night, a miracle of coordination and precision. To make this possible, the towers were placed carefully, each one built within the line of sight of the next. Engineers calculated the curve of the land, the height of the hills, the distance a column of smoke could be seen through mist or dust. The result was astonishing, a continent-scale network of communication, centuries before modern science. But China was not alone in this achievement. In the lands of the Byzantine Empire, where the mountains of Anatolia stretched between the east and Constantinople, another great network flickered into being. It was called the Anatolian Beacon Chain, and it connected the empire's farthest frontier with its beating heart. 9 towers, each one a fortress of stone, stood across the mountains, spaced roughly 40 miles apart. At each, guards watched the horizon with anxious patience. When the first fire appeared, often from the easternmost post at Lulan, near the borders of the Caliphate, the next tower would answer. From mountain to mountain, the message would travel westward, finally reaching the city where the emperor awaited. The system was so refined that it could convey complex messages by the number and timing of the lights. Some say it even had a schedule, certain times of day for routine updates, others reserved for emergencies. Imagine it, a vast empire, its safety depending on the rhythm of flames, its fate traveling on beams of light through the night sky. In Persia, too, light became empire. The Achaemenid kings long before Alexander, long before Rome, built one of the first organized communication systems the world had ever seen. They called it the Royal Road, and along its 1,700-mile route from Sardis to Susa stood relay stations and fire posts. These stations served 2 purposes. By day, they sheltered messengers on horseback. By night, they carried lighted signals. Herodotus wrote of Persian riders who could carry news faster than any others. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night deters them from their appointed course. But behind those riders was another, quieter network, one of smoke and light, ensuring that the riders themselves were guided and warned across the empire. Thus, the Persians wove together 2 kinds of communication, the physical and the ethereal, the road and the fire. It was the first time humans blended infrastructure and information. In Greece, the idea took on its own form. Here, the terrain was different. Islands and peninsulas, mountains that rose from the sea. But the Greeks, too, learned to bridge these distances with light. They used torch relays during wartime, sending messages across islands with remarkable speed. One of the most famous stories, half myth, half history, tells of the fall of Troy. According to legend, Queen Clytemnestra of Mycenae received news of Troy's destruction through a chain of beacons stretching across the Aegean. From the ruins of Troy, a flame was lit. Then from Mount Ida, to Lemnos, to Athos, to Macystus, across the land and sea, until it reached Argos and Mycenae. Within a single night, the news of victory traveled across hundreds of miles. Whether myth or memory, it captures a deep truth, that even in the ancient imagination, light was the messenger of fate. Each of these networks, Chinese, Persian, Greek, Byzantine, was different in design, but identical in spirit. Each one proved that connection could be engineered, that human beings could take something as chaotic as the horizon and turn it into a line of communication, precise, repeatable, dependable. In doing so, they changed not only the speed of news, but the nature of power itself. Before these networks, rulers ruled by proximity. They could only control what they could see. After the rise of signal systems, they could rule from afar, because information could travel faster than the body. In a sense, light became a new form of rule, an invisible empire that bound the visible one together. These networks did more than defend empires. They shaped how people thought about time. Before them, news traveled at the pace of footsteps or sails. After them, it traveled at the pace of flame. For the first time, humans began to measure time not by the rising of the sun but by the speed of a message. When a fire was lit on one mountain, watchers down the line would count the moments until the next tower answered. It was a primitive form of synchronization, the first attempt to unify clocks across distance. Each flash of light was not only a signal, but a pulse of shared time, a rhythm that linked cities, soldiers, and kings. Of course, these systems were fragile. A single storm could silence them. A watchtower left unmanned could break the chain. A careless mistake, one wrong flame could send panic through the land. But fragility did not make them failures. In truth, it made them more human. Because like us, these systems relied on trust, on people paying attention, on individuals keeping faith with one another across vast space. Every flame that leaped from one tower to the next was an act of cooperation, a promise that someone was awake, someone was watching, someone cared enough to keep the message alive. And that, more than the engineering, was what made these networks endure for centuries. They were built not only on stone and fire, but on belief. By the dawn of the first millennium, these systems had reached astonishing scale. In China, new dynasties expanded and rebuilt the beacon lines, improving them with gunpowder smoke and colored flames. In the Mediterranean, the Byzantines rebuilt their towers after invasions and earthquakes, keeping the tradition alive even as the empire crumbled. The idea of a connected world had taken hold. The physical roads of trade were mirrored by the invisible roads of communication, and together, they formed the nervous system of civilization. It was as if humanity had learned to think across its own body, the fires acting as neurons, the watchers as synapses, carrying thought and warning from one end of the world to the other. For the first time, humanity was not just scattered tribes or cities, it was a connected organism. When we look at those crumbling towers today, lonely silhouettes against the hills, it is easy to forget what they once were. They were not ruins of stone, they were transmitters. Each one was alive, pulsing with messages that traveled faster than sound. Each one was part of something larger, a vision of a world bound together by light, and though their fires are long extinguished, their pattern remains in us. Every network we build, every signal we send, every fiber optic line glowing beneath the ocean, all are echoes of those first beacons. The difference is only in speed. The dream remains the same. To be connected, to know and be known, to send meaning into the dark, and hope that someone, somewhere, will see it and answer. The whispering towers? How knowledge moved through fire, soft hum of wind, a faint crackle of torchlight in the dark. The rhythm of time resumes. When the first beacon flared to life on a distant mountain, it was not just a warning, it was a message. And every message, no matter how simple, carries a whisper of intelligence. In this chapter, we step closer to those ancient flames, to the men and women who kept them alive, to the knowledge they guarded, and to the stories that passed between them through smoke and light. Because in the end, what began as a way to warn of danger became something much greater, a way to speak without words, to teach without books, to connect minds across distance. The first beacon keepers were not just soldiers, they were watchers, scribes, and sometimes poets of the horizon. At dawn, they would climb the rough stone stairs of their towers. At dusk, they would light the fire that could mean life or death. Their duty was heavy, but it shaped them into something almost mythic. Each watcher knew he was part of a chain, a human link in a system larger than himself. But as time went on, these towers began to do more than signal war. They began to whisper knowledge. Messages evolved from simple alerts into coded information, trade updates, royal decrees, news of births, or even philosophical questions. And somewhere between the practical and the poetic, the ancient world stumbled upon something extraordinary: communication as a form of memory. In the Han Dynasty, for example, the beacon keepers weren't only soldiers. Many were trained in the art of message coding. A specific number of smoke plumes could mean enemy approaching, but another combination might mean reinforcements needed or supplies running low. Some historians suggest there were even signals for weather patterns, critical for farmers and merchants. Thus, each tower became not just a defense post, but a hub of information, an early version of a weather station or news agency. The watchers learned to interpret shades of smoke and the timing of flames. A thin wisp might mean routine report, a thick, dark plume, an emergency. Light and darkness became an alphabet. The mountains turned into message boards, and the empire itself began to think in code. Far to the west, the Byzantine Empire refined this art to a near-scientific level. Their network of towers stretched across rugged terrain, and with it came a new invention, the system of timing signals. The Byzantines realized that by combining light with time, they could send more complex information. They created schedules, where certain hours of the night represented specific meanings. A fire lit at the first hour after sunset might mean border attack. At the third hour, it could mean urgent imperial dispatch. At dawn, safe passage confirmed. This system required absolute precision. To coordinate it, they used water clocks, great bronze vessels that dripped water at a steady rate to mark the hours. Each tower had one, synchronized as best as possible with the others. When the first beacon was lit, the next would check the clock, interpret the time, and light its own carrion, not just flame, but context. It was the first experiment in temporal communication, a distant ancestor of the modern time stamp. But beyond these formal systems, there were the unofficial messages, the quiet human ones. When soldiers and watchers lived for months in lonely towers, far from their families, they found ways to speak to one another beyond official codes. In some records from the late Thames dynasty, there are mentions of signal songs, melodies whistled or tapped with metal bowls between nearby outposts. In the deserts of Persia, smoke patterns could carry informal greetings between stations. A faint puff at sunset might mean all is well. A brief double light might mean, I see you, friend. Simple gestures, but filled with meaning. Even amid the machinery of empire, humanity found its voice. There is a story, half legend, half truth, of a pair of beacon keepers along the Silk Road, separated by 50 miles of desert. They served under different commanders, spoke different dialects, yet for years, they kept their fires in perfect rhythm. At first it was routine signals of safety, danger, supply, but over time, they began to develop their own pattern, small differences in the flame's duration, subtle shifts in timing. Through those slight variations, they created a private code, a language only the two of them understood. For decades, no one knew what they said. Then one day, after years of service, one watcher failed to light his fire. The other waited all night, then all week. He never saw the answering flame again. But legend says that when he left his post, he carved a message into the tower's wall. For many nights, we spoke across the desert. I never saw your face, but I knew your heart by the light. Perhaps it is only a story, but it captures something profound. That communication, even in its earliest form, was not only about survival, it was about connection. By the height of the Roman Empire, the idea of distant communication had spread beyond military use. Roman engineers used torch relays along their vast road systems to carry information between provinces. But merchants began using the same methods for trade. When a caravan reached one station, it could send a torch signal to the next city announcing its arrival. The merchants waiting there could prepare supplies, or negotiate before the goods even arrived. It was business through light, a glowing forerunner of modern logistics. Later, in Roman Egypt, where watchtowers lined the Nile, priests used controlled fires to mark religious festivals or astronomical events. Each temple along the river would light its beacon at the precise moment of the equinox, creating a cascade of light that stretched from one end of the delta to the other. What began as war's tool became a calendar of civilization. In some places, these towers also became schools of knowledge. When signal keepers weren't on duty, they were often trained in astronomy, geometry, and fire management. To keep the fires burning cleanly, they learned the chemistry of fuel, pine wood for thick smoke, dried reeds for quick ignition, animal fats for brightness. They observed the weather, the stars, the direction of wind. They learned patience, a kind of meditative awareness that only centuries later monks would seek to imitate. And in their solitude, they sometimes wrote. Fragments of poems and notes carved into the walls of watchtowers have been found from China to Anatolia, simple lines, but filled with the quiet wisdom of men who watched both the sky and the world below. The wind carries news I cannot hear. I have sent my fire. I wonder who sees it. Light travels farther than hope, but not as far as memory. Those are not commands. They are reflections, proof that the first networks of the world were not only made of stone and flame, but of thought. As centuries passed, these systems grew more refined. Chinese engineers experimented with colored smoke, using materials like wolf dung, straw, and sulfur to produce distinct hues. White smoke for peace, black for invasion, red for royal decree. A rainbow of meaning rising from mountaintops. Elsewhere, the Greeks experimented with hydraulic telegraphs, water-filled vessels marked with different messages. When two identical vessels were opened at the same time, and a torch signal given, the level of water would correspond to a specific meaning, an early mechanical version of synchronized data transfer. Each experiment, in its own way, pushed humanity closer to something astonishing, the dream of instant understanding. And yet, for all this brilliance, what may be most striking is what these systems felt like. Imagine standing at your post, the wind cold, the sky dark, waiting for a flicker of light far on the horizon. You have no words, no sound, only distance and trust. Then, just before dawn, you see it, a faint glow where there was none before. You raise your torch, answer it, and for one moment, one beautiful, fleeting moment, two distant souls are connected. The silence between them is filled with meaning. This was communication before noise, before chatter, before screens, before the world became crowded with signals. It was pure elemental, as if the earth itself were speaking through its fires. Even now, when satellites blink above us and fiber optics hum beneath our feet, something ancient lingers in those patterns. Every time we send a message into the digital void, every email, every transmission, every flare of data, we are repeating the same act as those first watchers. We light a signal in the dark, hoping someone will see it and understand. The tools have changed. The essence has not. We are still whispering through the towers. Only now, they're made of glass and wire. The architects of connection, builders of the signal towers long before engineers drew blueprints or builders poured concrete. There were men and women who shaped the landscape with instinct, patience, and stone. They were not kings, nor priests, nor generals, yet the fate of empires rested upon their craft. They were the architects of connection, the forgotten builders who designed the signal towers of the ancient world. Without them, no flame could travel, no warning could be sent, no empire could stay united. Their towers were the arteries of civilization, silent monuments of communication that once bridged the impossible distances between mountains, deserts, and seas. This is their story, of how they built light into the bones of the earth. The earliest beacons were humble things, piles of stones on high hills, or wooden masts tied together with rope. But as kingdoms grew, so too did ambition. Rulers wanted something that would last, something that could outlive the seasons and the storms. So, they turned to architects of endurance. In the highlands of northern China, during the Zhou dynasty, master builders were assigned to design what they called Yantai smoke platforms. These were the ancestors of the Great Wall's watchtowers. Made of compacted earth and clay bricks, they rose above the plains like giant sentinels. Each was placed according to careful calculation. The builders studied the horizon, measuring visibility with bronze mirrors and sighting poles. They understood that light bends with distance, that haze changes color at dawn and dusk. To them, building a tower was not only a feat of labor, it was an act of geometry, of understanding the marriage between earth and vision. The best sites were high ridges or mountain saddles, where the line of sight stretched farthest. But those places were often remote and brutal. There were no roads. Workers had to drag materials by hand or mule, hauling stones up steep cliffs, sometimes building scaffolds against sheer drops. In old poems from the Book of Odes, there are verses that hint at their struggle. We built upon the wind's edge, where the eagles turn, and the fire watches the clouds. Each tower demanded not just labor, but devotion. Some projects took years. Whole families lived at construction sites, masons, cooks, water carriers, and scribes who recorded the work. In many regions, when a tower was finished, the builders would leave a small offering inside, a clay jar with rice, or a carved stone, or a lock of hair, tokens of life sealed within the foundation. They believed that as long as the tower stood, their spirit would remain awake within it. When the Great Wall began to take shape centuries later, this tradition evolved into an art. Engineers under the Qin and Han dynasties created an astonishing system of measurement for beacon towers. Each was built roughly every 3 to 5 kilometers, depending on the terrain. To determine visibility, surveyors used bronze heliographs, mirrors that flashed sunlight to test whether one tower could see another before construction began. If the light could be caught by the next tower's receiver, the location was approved. If not, the tower was moved, even if it meant rebuilding from scratch. Thus, every beacon became part of a mathematical web, a map not drawn on paper but on the living earth itself. And through that map, the ancient Chinese engineers created what was, in essence, a network of precision. Each tower's height, angle, and distance were tuned to its neighbor like instruments in a vast symphony of stone. In Persia, the builders of the Achaemenid Empire faced different challenges. Their land was harsh deserts that swallowed sound and vision alike, but they found genius in simplicity. They built fire stations along the royal road, each one perched on an elevation or an artificial mound. To make the towers visible at night, they used polished copper dishes to amplify the flame, a kind of ancient reflector technology. When the wind howled through the salt plains, they surrounded the fires with high, circular walls to protect the light. Inside these enclosures, priests of fire, often Zoroastrian caretakers, tended the flames as sacred duties. For them, the tower was not just a tool of empire, but a temple of truth. Every spark symbolized Asha, order and truth, which, according to their faith, must be preserved against the chaos of darkness. Thus, engineering met spirituality. Each tower was both a structure and a prayer. Further west, in Byzantium, the art of tower building reached architectural beauty. The Byzantine towers were crafted not merely for height but for endurance. Stone by stone, they were built to resist earthquakes, storms, and centuries of neglect. Architects developed an ingenious method, alternating layers of limestone and brick. The limestone absorbed moisture, the bricks gave flexibility. This pattern, visible even today in the ruins scattered across Anatolia, created a distinctive rhythm, like musical notation written in stone. At the summit of each tower stood an iron brazier, supported by beams of olive wood and surrounded by marble slabs to reflect heat. Some towers had small signal chapels within them, where monks prayed for safe transmission, their chants mingling with the crackle of fire. It was architecture that merged the sacred and the practical, light and faith, form and function. But who were these architects really? Few names survive. Most of their stories are buried in dust and legend, yet in fragments of old scrolls and carvings, a few figures emerge. One such man was Lu Jin, an imperial builder during the Han Dynasty. He wrote a brief text known as Notes on the Towers of the North. Only a few lines remain, but they reveal a mind centuries ahead of its time. To see is to know. To build is to extend the eye. The tower is not a house for men, but a body for fire. Another, from the Mediterranean world, was Andronikos of Aegea, a Greek architect believed to have designed several early beacon towers on Aegean islands. He also built a strange monument in Athens, the Tower of the Winds, which functioned as both a timepiece and a weather indicator. Some scholars believe he was obsessed with the idea of universal visibility, that buildings could capture and channel natural forces. His designs inspired later Roman and Byzantine engineers to align their towers not only by geography, but also by celestial points, ensuring that signal routes followed the paths of the sun and stars. Thus, architecture became a conversation between heaven and earth. In the records of the Tang engineers, one finds incredible detail about the materials used. To make the beacons bright, they mixed pine resin and animal fat, sometimes adding saltpeter for longer burns. For the structure itself, they preferred rammed earth mixed with crushed stone, durable yet flexible under frost. The outer layer was lined with glazed tiles to protect against rain and to reflect moonlight, helping nearby towers see each other even in dim conditions. These details seem mundane, but they reveal a profound truth. Every brick, every calculation, was an expression of belief that connection was worth building. The towers were not luxury, they were a necessity, and their builders understood that the survival of entire civilizations depended on the integrity of their work. To test new towers, ancient inspectors devised elaborate fire drills. On moonless nights, a fire would be lit at the easternmost station. If the final western tower did not respond within a given time, builders were called back to adjust the line of sight. Sometimes it took weeks of correction, raising one platform by a few feet, moving another slightly to the right. This was not guesswork. It was early data calibration, using human eyes and natural light instead of instruments. The precision they achieved, given their tools, remains astonishing. In some regions, signal chains spanned hundreds of kilometers, with almost perfect relay reliability. That reliability was built, stone by people whose names history forgot. Many towers outlasted the empires that built them. Some were abandoned and later reused as shrines, hermitages, or lighthouses. Travelers in medieval times often mistook them for ancient temples, and perhaps, in a way they were, temples to connection. For even when their fires died, the towers still stood, silent reminders that human beings once carved communication into the land itself. Their shapes still haunt our skylines. The lighthouse, the church bell tower, the minaret, the radio mast, all descendants of the same ancient dream. The dream to be seen, to be heard, to bridge the distance between minds. If you travel today along the old routes of the Silk Road, you can still find them lonely silhouettes on the horizon. Their stones are eroded, their steps buried under sand. But when the sun sets, and the mountains turn gold, they seem to glow again, as if remembering what they once were. They stand like old neurons of the world's first mind, towers that once thought in fire and shadow. Every line of sight that passed between them was a thought, every flame a memory. And when we build our networks today, the cables beneath oceans, the satellites above, we are rebuilding those same ancient lines, invisible but alive. The architects of connection may be gone, but their work continues every time a light travels across the sky, every time one signal finds another. The architects of connection, the builders who designed the signal towers. We journey into the world of ancient engineers, the forgotten architects who carved light into the landscape and built the backbone of early communication itself. Long before engineers drew blueprints or builders poured concrete, there were men and women who shaped the landscape with instinct, patience, and stone. They were not kings, nor priests, nor generals, yet the fate of empires rested upon their craft. They were the architects of connection, the forgotten builders who designed the signal towers of the ancient world. Without them, no flame could travel, no warning could be sent, no empire could stay united. Their towers were the arteries of civilization, silent monuments of communication that once bridged the impossible distances between mountains, deserts, and seas. This is their story, of how they built light into the bones of the earth. The earliest beacons were humble things, piles of stones on high hills, or wooden masts tied together with rope. But as kingdoms grew, so too did ambition. Rulers wanted something that would last, something that could outlive the seasons and the storms. So, they turned to architects of endurance. In the highlands of northern China, during the Zhou dynasty, master builders were assigned to design what they called yantai smoke platforms. These were the ancestors of the Great Wall's watch, made of compacted earth and clay bricks. They rose above the plains like giant sentinels. Each was placed according to careful calculation. The builders studied the horizon, measuring visibility with bronze mirrors and sighting poles. They understood that light bends with distance, that haze changes color at dawn and dusk. To them, building a tower was not only a feat of labor, it was an act of geometry, of understanding the marriage between earth and vision. The best sites were high ridges or mountain saddles, where the line of sight stretched farthest. But those places were often remote and brutal. There were no roads. Workers had to drag materials by hand or mule, hauling stones up steep cliffs, sometimes building scaffolds against sheer drops. In old poems from the Book of Odes, there are verses that hint at their struggle. We built upon the wind's edge, where the eagles turn and the fire watches the clouds. Each tower demanded not just labor, but devotion. Some projects took years. Whole families lived at construction sites, masons, cooks, water carriers, and scribes who recorded the work. In many regions, when a tower was finished, the builders would leave a small offering inside, a clay jar with rice, or a carved stone, or a lock of hair, tokens of life sealed within the foundation. They believed that as long as the tower stood, their spirit would remain awake within it. When the Great Wall began to take shape centuries later, this tradition evolved into an art. Engineers under the Qin and Han dynasties created an astonishing system of measurement for beacon towers. Each was built roughly every 3 to 5 kilometers, depending on the terrain. To determine visibility, surveyors used bronze heliographs, mirrors that flashed sunlight to test whether one tower could see another before construction began. If the light could be caught by the next tower's receiver, the location was approved. If not, the tower was moved, even if it meant rebuilding from scratch. Thus, every beacon became part of a mathematical web, a map not drawn on paper but on the living earth itself. And through that map, the ancient Chinese engineers created what was, in essence, a network of precision. Each tower's height, angle, and distance were tuned to its neighbor like instruments in a vast symphony of stone. In Persia, the builders of the Achaemenid Empire faced different challenges. Their land was harsh deserts that swallowed sound and vision alike, but they found genius in simplicity. They built fire stations along the royal road, each one perched on an elevation or an artificial mound. To make the towers visible at night, they used polished copper dishes to amplify the flame, a kind of ancient reflector technology. When the wind howled through the salt plains, they surrounded the fires with high, circular walls to protect the light. Inside these enclosures, priests of fire, often Zoroastrian caretakers, tended the flames as sacred duties. For them, the tower was not just a tool of empire, but a temple of truth. Every spark symbolized Asha, order, and truth, which, according to their faith, must be preserved against the chaos of darkness. Thus, engineering met spirituality. Each tower was both a structure and a prayer. Further west, in Byzantium, the art of tower building reached architectural beauty. The Byzantine towers were crafted not merely for height but for endurance. Stone by stone, they were built to resist earthquakes, storms, and centuries of neglect. Architects developed an ingenious method, alternating layers of limestone and brick. The limestone absorbed moisture, the bricks gave flexibility. This pattern, visible even today in the ruins scattered across Anatolia, created a distinctive rhythm like musical notation written in stone. At the summit of each tower stood an iron brazier, supported by beams of olive wood and surrounded by marble slabs to reflect heat. Some towers had small signal chapels within them, where monks prayed for safe transmission, their chants mingling with the crackle of fire. It was architecture that merged the sacred and the practical, light and faith, form and function. But who were these architects really? Few names survive. Most of their stories are buried in dust and legend, yet in fragments of old scrolls and carvings, a few figures emerge. One such man was Lu Jin, an imperial builder during the Han dynasty. He wrote a brief text known as Notes on the Towers of the North. Only a few lines remain, but they reveal a mind centuries ahead of its time. To see is to know. To build is to extend the eye. The tower is not a house for men, but a body for fire. Another, from the Mediterranean world, was Andronikos of Aegea, a Greek architect believed to have designed several early beacon towers on Aegean islands. He also built a strange monument in Athens, the Tower of the Winds, which functioned as both a timepiece and a weather indicator. Some scholars believe he was obsessed with the idea of universal visibility, that buildings could capture and channel natural forces. His designs inspired later Roman and Byzantine engineers to align their towers not only by geography, but also by celestial points, ensuring that signal routes followed the paths of the sun and stars. Thus, architecture became a conversation between heaven and earth. In the records of the Temps engineers, one finds incredible detail about the materials used. To make the beacons bright, they mixed pine, resin, and animal fat, sometimes adding saltpeter for longer burns. For the structure itself, they preferred rammed earth mixed with crushed stone, durable yet flexible under frost. The outer layer was lined with glazed tiles to protect against rain and to reflect moonlight, helping nearby towers see each other even in dim conditions. These details seem mundane, but they reveal a profound truth. Every brick, every calculation, was an expression of belief that connection was worth building. The towers were not luxury. They were necessity, and their builders understood that the survival of entire civilizations depended on the integrity of their work. To test new towers, ancient inspectors devised elaborate fire drills. On moonless nights, a fire would be lit at the easternmost station. If the final western tower did not respond within a given time, builders were called back to adjust the line of sight. Sometimes it took weeks of correction, raising one platform by a few feet, moving another slightly to the right. This was not guesswork. It was early data calibration, using human eyes and natural light instead of instruments. The precision they achieved, given their tools, remains astonishing. In some regions, signal chains spanned hundreds of kilometers, with almost perfect relay reliability. That reliability was built, stone by stone, by people whose names history forgot. Many towers outlasted the empires that built them. Some were abandoned and later reused as shrines, hermitages, or lighthouses. Travelers in medieval times often mistook them for ancient temples, and perhaps, in a way, they were temples to connection. For even when their fires died, the towers still stood, silent reminders that human beings once carved communication into the land itself. Their shapes still haunt our skylines: the lighthouse, the church bell tower, the minaret, the radio mast, all descendants of the same ancient dream. The dream to be seen, to be heard, to bridge the distance between minds. If you travel today along the old routes of the Silk Road, you can still find them, lonely silhouettes on the horizon. Their stones are eroded, their steps buried under sand. But when the sun sets, and the mountains turn gold, they seem to glow again, as if remembering what they once were. They stand like old neurons of the world's first mind, towers that once thought in fire and shadow. Every line of sight that passed between them was a thought, every flame, a memory, and when we build our networks today, the cables beneath oceans, the satellites above, we are rebuilding those same ancient lines, invisible but alive. The architects of connection may be gone, but their work continues every time a light travels across the sky, every time one signal finds another. Signals beyond the empire. Smoke, fire, and the ancient worlds shared language long before telegraphs hummed and satellites whispered across the sky. Humankind found its own simple genius, the universal language of light and smoke. Across distant continents, from the dry cliffs of Greece to the wind-bitten deserts of North Africa, different civilizations unaware of one another's tongues, gods, and empires, all discovered the same truth: that flame could carry thought, and smoke could bridge silence. Imagine a world without roads or wires, without ships fast enough to cross the seas in days, without written letters that could travel swiftly. In such a world, the sun rose upon people separated not just by mountains, but by time itself. And yet, they found ways to speak brief, bright messages that leaped from hill to hill, carried not by sound, but by sight. One of the earliest known examples comes from the ancient Greeks. In the 8th century BCE, long before the word technology had meaning, the city-states of Greece guarded their coastlines with beacon towers. They called them phroktores. From mountain peaks overlooking the Aegean, they sent messages by fire. 1 flame meant safety, 2, a warning, 3, invasion. Each city watched for the next spark on the horizon, passing the signal down the line. Herodotus tells of how the Greeks relayed news of the fall of Troy across the Aegean, from Mount Ida to Mycenae, through a chain of In one night, the story of victory traveled hundreds of miles, the first long-distance broadcast in human memory. To those who saw it, it must have felt like a miracle. The gods themselves seem to have carried the flame. Further west, in the deserts of North Africa, the Carthaginians used a similar method. On the edges of their trade routes, where silence could mean death, they built signal towers that burned at night and shone mirrors by day. Their caravans depended on them. A single smoke could warn of raiders, or call for water and aid. The Phoenicians, their seafaring ancestors, did the same along the coastlines of the Mediterranean, lighting fires on headlands so ships could communicate by night. These were not mere warnings, but conversations between land and sea. In Egypt, smoke became more than a message. It became ritual. On the high banks of the Nile, priests once burned incense at specific times of day, a fragrant signal to temples downstream, marking the rhythm of religious ceremonies. In a sense, it was timekeeping by scent and sight, a network of sacred communication where smoke carried not fear, but devotion. Across the world, in the dry hills of the Andes, the Inca Empire, vast and intricate, used signal fires to complement their famous runner network, the chasqui. When speed was essential, they lit fires on the mountain passes. The sight of one blaze would send the next station into motion, the next and the next, until Cusco, the beating heart of the empire, received the message. In minutes, warnings from the outer provinces could reach the capital, a feat unmatched even in parts of Europe at the time. And in the forests of North America, long before European contact, many indigenous tribes used smoke to communicate between camps. They learned to shape the plumes, short bursts for greetings, long trails for warnings. It was an art of timing and rhythm. each tribe with its own dialect of smoke. Even today, stories remain of scouts sending messages from one hill to another, speaking through the sky. Everywhere, the elements were the same: fire, air, and human intent, yet the meanings were infinite. This was not coincidence. It was convergence. Across different worlds, people faced the same challenge: distance. And across that challenge, they invented nearly the same solution. But the systems grew more complex than mere warning fires. Some civilizations tried to encode words and sentences to make flames speak language. The Greeks, ever fond of logic and order, experimented with a method called the Polybius square. Centuries after the first beacons, using a 5x5 grid of letters, they could spell out words by flashing pairs of torches. One torch to the left, another to the right. Each position meant a different letter. It was slow, deliberate, and astonishingly precise. For the first time, fire had grammar. The Romans, inheriting and expanding on Greek ingenuity, used beacon chains to coordinate armies across vast distances. Along the Rhine and in Britain, signal towers rose on hills and coastlines. In times of invasion, the sequence of fires guided legions like the beat of a drum. There are records of messages traveling from fortress to fortress faster than a mounted messenger could ride. An empire communicating by light. Yet, the beauty of these inventions lies not only in their practicality but in their symbolism. To light a beacon was an act of faith. Faith that someone, somewhere, would see it. The message was useless if unseen. It required trust in the next watcher, in the next flame. It was human cooperation made visible, a chain of shared purpose stretching across land and time. In medieval Persia, travelers along the Silk Road wrote of beacon stations rising like small citadels, each one manned by guards who waited through long, moonless nights. When raiders or sandstorms approached, they lit the fires. The message could reach hundreds of miles eastward into the heart of Asia. Marco Polo himself described how these fires guided caravans safely across the empire of Kublai Khan, a network so vast it seemed to breathe with its own pulse. The Mongols, masters of mobility, perfected this idea. Their empire, stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea, relied on communication faster than any before it. Along their trade routes they built relay stations, each one a post of horses and riders. But at key mountain points, they used signal fires to ire by night, mirrors by day. A warning at the Chinese frontier could reach Samarkand in a fraction of the time a single courier could ride. The entire empire shimmered with connection, and while the East and West never truly shared a single communication network, their systems echoed one another as if humanity, separated by oceans and languages, was working on the same invention under different skies. The same instinct, the same brilliance, appearing again and again, to overcome silence with light. Yet even the simplest invention bears the weight of meaning. For all their usefulness, beacon fires also carried symbolism, hope, fear, anticipation. In Greece, a signal meant salvation or doom. In China, it meant vigilance and duty. Among the Carthaginians, it meant survival in the wilderness. Every culture wove its own story around the flame. It became more than a message. It became a metaphor for endurance, for how the smallest spark, properly tended, could carry across the darkest expanse. When we think of ancient communication, we often imagine scrolls, messengers, and carved tablets. But perhaps the truest symbol of our ancestors' brilliance is the sight of fire dancing against the horizon. A fleeting word of light sent from one soul to another. Across mountains, deserts, and seas, it was the same gesture: I see you. You are not alone. And maybe that's the deepest truth of all these forgotten inventions. The beacon, the smoke, the mirror, they were not just tools of empire, but expressions of something more profound. Our longing to connect, to bridge the spaces between us. In every age, humans have lit fires not only for warmth or war, but to remind the world and themselves that they exist. Tonight, when we look at the blinking lights of cities from an airplane window, or the distant towers glowing in the dark, we are seeing the same old story replayed. A new kind of beacon system powered by wires and glass instead of wood and oil, still carries our voices across great distances. The tools have changed, but the message remains the same. We have always been creatures of communication, and long before the first word was written, our ancestors were already speaking through fire. The human element, trust, error, and the fragile chain of light. For every empire that lit its watch, for every flame that flickered across the mountains, there was one truth that bound them all together. Communication, however ingenious, was never perfect. It depended not only on invention, but on people. The fires could not burn without hands to tend them, nor could the messages fly without eyes to see. And where there are people, there are doubts, fears, and the quiet trembling of error. The ancient beacon systems, those long chains of fire, stretching across kingdoms, were not machines. They were living systems, made of fragile human hearts. Behind each signal stood a man staring into the horizon, waiting for a sign. Behind every success lay 100 small chances for failure: fog, fatigue, fear, or a simple misreading of the light. In the northern provinces of ancient China, where the wind rolled endlessly through the grasslands, The life of a watchman was both honorable and punishing. The Great Wall's beacon towers demanded constant readiness. But how could one be ready every hour, every night, every season? When nothing happened for months, the stillness itself became an enemy. The human mind, built from movement and conversation, struggled with silence. So mistakes crept in, quiet, unintentional, human. Sometimes a gust of wind would stir up dust, and a watchman, half asleep, might think at the approach of horsemen. A torch was lit, a signal sent. Within hours, the entire frontier might be ablaze with false alarms. Soldiers rushed to stations. Officers awoke the garrisons. Horses thundered across valleys. And by dawn, all realized it had been the wind, nothing more. The empire sighed in frustration, a night of panic born from a single spark of misunderstanding. The Chinese chronicles speak of such incidents, and not kindly, but they also reveal something deeper, that even in failure, the system worked. The chain of light responded. The towers saw and answered, just as they were built to do. It was human fallibility inside a structure of brilliance. And so the empire learned to balance faith with skepticism, duty with discernment. New rules were written. No single man could light the beacon without a second's confirmation. No signal would be passed until verified by both the eye and the mirror. The fire would burn, but not without thought. Centuries later, across the Mediterranean, another false flame would change history. In Greece, during the wars of the Hellenistic kings, a general ordered a beacon lit to summon reinforcements, but his men, confused by the code, misunderstood. They thought the signal meant retreat. The army pulled back at the worst possible moment. The enemy advanced, and the battle was lost. That day, a single tower, one moment of human error, changed the outcome of a campaign. The historians called it the misfire of the hills. The soldiers called it something else, the night the fire lied. Yet even they knew the truth. It was not the fire that lied, but the men who failed to listen carefully to its language. The irony of these ancient inventions was that, for all their brilliance, they were utterly dependent on the frailest element of all trust. The entire network worked only because each person along the chain believed the next would do their part. A tower that hesitated, or a watcher who doubted what he saw, could break the system. Silence was as dangerous as haste. In the deserts of Persia, where the Silk Road cut through endless sand, trust became a form of currency. Caravans relied on signal towers to warn of danger. But sometimes, raiders would light false fires to lure travelers off course. The result was chaos, lost caravans, broken supply lines, vanished traders. The empire responded by training special fire officers, whose job was not just to watch, but to interpret. They learned to read the rhythm of each signal, to know which tower's flame burned steady and which flickered like deceit. Communication was not only about speed, but about character, knowing the soul of the one who sent the light. There's something beautifully human in that. Even as people created these vast systems of technology, primitive yet perfect for their time, they could never remove the need for faith. No empire could fully automate its trust. Between every two towers, there was always a gap that could only be bridged by belief. The poet Levi once wrote of this fragility. One fire lights the next, but between them lies the night. He understood what every watcher did, that the message depended on courage as much as flame. In times of fear, when enemies approached, lighting the beacon meant exposure. To reveal your position by fire was to risk being seen by the very foe you warned against. But duty was stronger than fear. Many lit their signals knowing it might be their last act. Stories were told of towers destroyed of watchers who held the flame even as arrows fell, of towers that, once ignited, continued to burn long after their defenders were gone, the message still alive, the men silent. In these tales, fire became not only a signal of danger but a symbol of sacrifice. The empire would remember their names, even if the world forgot their words. In later centuries, when scholars studied the old systems, they were fascinated by their precision, but also by their fragility. They marveled that an entire realm could depend on something so ephemeral as smoke. But perhaps that was the point. Communication has always been a matter of impermanence. The message is never meant to last forever. It is meant to arrive. The Romans learned this lesson well. Their beacon network stretched across the empire, from Britain's cold cliffs to the deserts of Syria. But they too faced the same human problems. A night of fog could delay a message for hours. A nervous sentry could mistake lightning for an enemy signal. To minimize error, they standardized the timing signal sent only at dusk or dawn, when visibility was certain. Even so, misfires occurred, and each one reminded them that the greatest invention was only as strong as its weakest heart. It is tempting to think of these systems as technological marvels, but at their core, they were human stories. Stories of waiting, of watching, of believing. In every tower, a handful of men stared into darkness, waiting for something that might never come. They kept their eyes open, because someone far away depended on them. The fire they lit might save thousands, or it might burn for nothing, but they lit it anyway. In a way, the beacon networks were early versions of what we now call communication networks, not just physical systems, but social ones. The watchers were nodes of trust, bound by duty and empathy. The fires were data, fragile and fleeting, and the night sky, that vast, silent space between towers was the uncertainty every civilization must learn to cross. It is said that the last great beacon of the Ming dynasty burned not for war, but for remembrance. The empire had begun to crumble, the frontier overrun, the towers abandoned. Yet one captain, old and nearly blind, climbed his tower and lit the fire one final time. When asked why, he said, "Because someone may still be watching." Perhaps that is the most enduring truth of all. Every signal, every invention, every spark of human communication, from the first smoke in the hills to the satellites that orbit us now, depends on the same quiet faith, the belief that someone, somewhere, will see the light and understand that. So when we look back upon the ancient beacon systems, we are not merely studying the birth of communication, we are witnessing the story of trust itself, fragile, fallible, and profoundly human. The science of fire and smoke, the ancient technology behind the signal for the watchers of the old world. Fire was not only a symbol, it was a science. The art of communication by light and smoke required precision, control, and understanding of elements that few truly mastered. To ignite a signal in the cold of night, to raise a column of smoke clear and dark enough to be seen from miles away, these were acts of knowledge as much as courage. Long before chemistry was a discipline, before physics had a name, ancient engineers and sentinels learned through observation and need. They studied the way wood burned, how smoke shifted with the wind, how flame could bend the air and turn light into language. What we see now as primitive improvisation was, in truth, a kind of practical genius, the earliest experiment in applied science. A fire was not just a fire, it was a message made visible. In China, where the Great Wall stretched across the high plains, the engineers of the Han and later the Tang dynasties perfected the beacon's construction. A proper signal fire, they believed, required three things: height, dryness, and the right material. Each tower was built upon a rise, natural or man-made, to give the signal the greatest range. Inside, the fire pit was prepared with layers of straw, pine branches, and the most curious of fuels, wolf dung. The reason, though unpleasant, was simple and brilliant. Wolf dung produced thick, heavy smoke that rose slowly and stayed visible for long distances. It clung to the air, black and oily, defiant even against wind. Mixed with straw and oil, it gave a dense column that could be seen from 15, sometimes 20 miles away. The recipe was passed down through generations of soldiers, guarded like a secret formula. Some used horse dung or reed ash when wolves were scarce, but none compared to the depth and endurance of that dark plume. At night, when smoke was invisible, the science shifted. The signal became about brightness and color. The watchers used oils, animal fat, tung oil, or sesame, to create flames that could be seen against the horizon. Mirrors made of polished bronze or steel, placed at calculated angles, amplified the light. These mirrors were sometimes called sun discs, their reflective surfaces able to project flickers far beyond what the naked flame could achieve. And when the moon was bright or clouds gathered low, they turned to sound. Drums, horns, and bells accompanied the light. Together they formed a synchronized system, a multisensory code of survival. The watchers, though soldiers by name, were scientists by necessity. They learned how humidity changed the smoke's density, how the direction of wind could betray the meaning of a signal, and how timing determined everything. To the west, in the Mediterranean world, similar sciences emerged independently. Greek engineers during the reign of Ptolemy in Egypt recorded experiments with smoke visibility. They observed that white smoke, made from burning straw, rose high but dispersed quickly, while dark smoke, from oil or tar, lingered longer and was visible even under bright sunlight. Using this knowledge, they improved the Frictoriae, the network of fire towers stretching between coastal cities. Greek philosophers even discussed the optics of light transmission. They realized that the curvature of the earth limited visibility. One ancient manuscript from the island of Samos described how a tower built too low could not see its neighbor's flame, even if the distance was short, because the sea's surface curved between them. To solve this, they built towers in a gradual arc, adjusting each to the height of the next, so the line of sight was never broken. In that, they anticipated the geometric thinking that would one day send satellites into orbit, farther south. The Egyptians blended firecraft with chemistry. They mixed minerals and resins into their signal fires to alter the color of the flame. Copper salts made it greenish-blue, iron gave it red, and sodium produced a yellow blaze. The colors were not just decoration. They were code. Red could mean war, blue could mark the arrival of a messenger, and white might signify peace or return. Each hue was a word in their lexicon of light, a painted language on the night air. The Romans, inheritors of all these innovations, built their own technical perfection into the art. The speculae were designed with exact proportions. The fire pit was centered, surrounded by clay walls that directed heat upward. Vents were carved to ensure airflow. Too little air, and the smoke choked. Too much, and it scattered. The Romans even standardized fuel, pitch oil and green wood, for controlled bursts of smoke. Manuals from their military archives mention ratios, 3 measures of pitch to 1 of straw, precise, repeatable, scientific. When we think of ancient science, We imagine philosophers or astronomers gazing at the stars. Yet here too, in the lonely work of a watchman tending his fire, science lived. It was a discipline of elements, of combustion and air, of signal and response. In Persia, this knowledge reached almost spiritual levels. The fire temples of Zoroastrian priests were not only sacred places, but also centers of technological insight. Priests studied the purity of flames, understanding how different fuels burned and what they revealed about divine order. Many of the empire's signal networks were managed by men trained in these temples, who believed that fire was a holy intermediary, a visible spirit of truth. For them, lighting a signal was not merely duty, it was a sacred act, a flame that joined heaven and earth. The Mongols, centuries later, adapted these sciences with unmatched efficiency. They used a combination of fire and powder, early gunpowder mixtures that flared intensely, visible for hundreds of miles in clear air. Their towers were equipped with bronze reflectors to catch and project sunlight during the day. Some historians claim these reflectors could transmit flashes of light over 40 miles. A primitive but astonishing form of heliograph, the ancestor of modern light-based communication. Even the humble materials, oil, dung ash, reveal the depth of understanding our ancestors possessed. To control smoke, one must control fire. To control fire, one must control chemistry. Every watcher was a quiet experimenter, balancing air, fuel, and flame in the delicate theater of survival. And they did so with precision that modern historians can only admire. But beyond the technical mastery lay something subtler, an understanding of perception itself. The watchers knew how the human eye worked, how distance dulled brightness, how contrast against the sky could enhance or hide a signal. They learned that in the golden light of dawn, dark smoke was harder to see, while in the evening, a red flame shone farthest. They adjusted their signals to the hour, aligning not only with nature, but with the rhythms of human sight. This ancient science of signal fire was not written in books or carved in stone. It was passed down through practice, from watcher to watcher, through whispered advice and observation. It was a living knowledge, evolving across centuries, fading only when its need disappeared. But in those years, when empires depended on the breath of flame, this science stood among the greatest quiet achievements of humanity. Perhaps it is poetic justice that the modern world's technologies, lasers, fiber optics, radio waves, still rely on the same principles. Light travels in lines. It needs clear paths. It can be encoded, decoded, interpreted. What began as smoke on the wind became the pulse of the modern world. Our cell towers and satellites are descendants of those first beacons. Our digital signals mere echoes of the ancient fires. When the old watchers lit their flames, they probably did not think of themselves as scientists. They were soldiers, guardians, weary souls, staring into the dark. But in the careful way they mixed their fuels, in how they judged the air and waited for the perfect stillness before sending a signal, there was method, there was knowledge. There was the beginning of everything we now call communication technology. They worked with what they had, the simplest of tools, the most primal of forces. Yet through their ingenuity, they turned nature into a messenger. They made the elements speak, and when the fire burned high and the smoke rose, the message, for all its simplicity, was never just one of warning. It was a declaration of mastery, that humanity, in its endless curiosity, could harness chaos itself, shaping flame into meaning. Even now, when the night is clear and distant lights flicker on far-off hills, it's hard not to imagine what it must have been like, that moment when the first watcher saw another flame answer his own. Two fires, two minds, connected across the void, proving that science and spirit have always burned in the same light. The decline of the beacon. When fire fell silent for centuries, the watchers stood by their towers, their eyes on the horizon, their hearts bound to the rhythm of smoke and flame. But as time moved forward, as kingdoms crumbled and new empires rose, the language of light began to fade. The beacons that once spoke across mountains and deserts fell silent, their fires cold, their meaning forgotten. It was not a single moment of disappearance, but a slow and quiet fading, like a candle burning low in a forgotten hall. The decline of the beacon was not only a tale of changing technology, but of changing trust, politics, and the very nature of communication itself. In the great expanse of northern China, where once the Great Wall shimmered with flames, the Tamps and later the Song dynasties inherited the ancient network of signal towers. But the world was different now. Cities had grown larger, messengers on horseback rode faster, and the art of written communication, sealed letters, carried by trusted couriers, had become an organized system. The emperors of the later dynasties began to rely more on human messengers than on the cold distance of light. Written words could be precise, detailed, and private. A fire in the night could mean many things. A scroll could mean only one. And so, the watchers still kept their posts, but fewer signals were lit. Many towers began to crumble. Some were abandoned after a generation of peace, others turned into storage for grain or weapons. The lonely art of the beacon keeper was quietly dying, and with it, a certain poetry of communication was lost. In Rome's shadowed twilight, the fall of the empire had already erased many of its sophisticated networks. The once proud speculae Roman watchtowers stood like hollow skeletons over ruined roads. In the western provinces, local chieftains or warlords sometimes used them for defense, but the system no longer connected the world as it once had. Communication in the medieval age became localized. Castles and towns sent riders instead of light. The fire signals, once symbols of a united command, now represented only fear, a desperate flare calling for help from isolated strongholds. In Byzantium, some remnants of the Roman ingenuity survived. The famous beacon of Chrysopolis, a vast signal network stretching from the Taurus Mountains to Constantinople, was still active in the 9th century. Chroniclers wrote that Emperor Theophilos used the beacons to learn of Arab incursions within hours, a marvel of its time. But when his successors lost interest, the system fell into disrepair. Towers were dismantled for stone, their bronze mirrors were melted for coin. The line went dark. By the 11th century, the empire had learned to rely instead on couriers and coded scrolls. Fire had served its age. Ink now carried its flame. Farther west, across the seas of Europe, the Middle Ages birthed new networks of warning, but they were crude echoes of the ancient brilliance. In England and Scotland, beacons were used sporadically, especially during invasions or border conflicts. Fires on hilltops warned of approaching armies. The Danes, the Scots, later, the Spanish, the most famous of these systems, emerged in the late 16th century. When Queen Elizabeth's England prepared for the threat of the Spanish Armada, from Cornwall to London, a chain of beacons was set, each visible to the next. When the Spanish fleet was spotted, flames leaped across the hills, carrying the alarm in less than 2 hours from the coast to the capital. It was a resurrection of an ancient idea, brief, magnificent, and temporary. Afterward, the beacons were left to rot once again, their ashes swept by wind. The system worked, but it belonged to an older rhythm of time. The modern world, with its ships, roads, and politics, demanded something more flexible, more discreet, and more reliable. The world had changed in another way. Too, the night itself had changed. In the ancient world, darkness was deep and absolute. The glow of a single fire could dominate the horizon, visible for miles across unlit lands. But as cities grew and torches burned along streets and ports, the distinction between signal and settlement began to blur. Light was no longer rare. The meaning of a distant flame was no longer certain. A beacon that once screamed war might now be mistaken for a village hearth. The sky, once a clean canvas for smoke and stars, was cluttered with human brightness. The language of fire had lost its silence. In Persia and the Islamic caliphates, the art of beacons survived longer, woven into systems of trade and governance. The Abbasids maintained beacon routes alongside their postal relays, the bird connecting Baghdad to distant provinces. But even there, innovation was turning elsewhere. Paper, ink, and the science of mathematics were creating a new kind of communication, one of record and permanence. Fire could only announce. Ink could explain. By the time the Mongols swept across Asia, the world of signal fires had become an inheritance of ruins. The Mongols revived it, yes, but in a different way. Their system was not the slow, ceremonial art of smoke and flame. It was practical, ruthless, and efficient. The Yam network of riders and stations. Messages traveled faster on horseback than any smoke could rise. Fire became secondary, used only for emergencies or as a sign of movement. The precision of organized couriers outpaced the poetry of light. The Mongols understood what earlier empires could not, that communication is not just about speed, but control. A fire can be seen by friend and foe alike, but a messenger can carry secrets. And so, even in their brilliance, the beacons began to die once more. By the dawn of the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered the sciences of Greece and Rome, the beacon had become a relic, a romantic image of old wars and lonely hills. Artists painted them as symbols of warning, poets spoke of them as metaphors for hope, but no one built new ones. Instead, inventors turned to lenses, glass, and the properties of reflection. The heliograph, a mirror-based signal device, was a conscious attempt to reclaim what the beacons had once done. It used light, but now with precision, not flame. With the heliograph, one could flash messages by day without smoke or fire, using Morse-like codes of reflection. It was the modern echo of the old science, geometry reborn. Still, even this could not halt the march of progress. In 1837, the electric telegraph was born, and with it, the age of instant transmission. What the beacon had done across 20 miles, the telegraph could do across continents. Wires replaced watchtowers, sparks replaced smoke, and language itself became electrical. The world once bound by horizon and fire was now bound by current and copper. It was the end of the ancient flame. Yet the decline of the beacon was not a failure, it was an evolution. The beacons did not vanish because they were useless, but because they had fulfilled their purpose. They had taught humanity how to think across distance, how to coordinate across space. They had given us the first shared experience of remote connection, a light seen by one soul, answered by another far away. Their silence was not death, it was transformation. Even after they disappeared, echoes of their presence lingered. In times of danger, people still lit fires on hills, in rebellion, in prayer, In mourning, the symbol endured because the idea endured that light could bring people together, even in fear. And so, the beacons became part of legend. In China, local stories told of watchers who saw phantom fires in the distance, the spirits of old sentinels warning of forgotten wars. In the British Isles, ghostly lights were said to burn on certain hills before great events, omens of change. In Persia, pilgrims lit small flames at ancient ruins, believing they honored both God and the memory of those who once guarded the empire. The light was gone from the towers, but not from the human imagination. When we look back now at the silence of those towers, we can feel a strange kind of peace. Progress demands silence from the old. Every new invention extinguishes something ancient. But what the beacons gave us remains alive in every spark of connection we now share. Our networks hum with invisible light. Our cities glow brighter than any empire's fire. And yet, the principle is the same, a chain of signals. Each one received and passed on. Each one keeping the world connected. Perhaps the watchers of old would understand this age better than we think. They too lived by messages carried through the unseen, trusting that their light would reach another mind far away. The only difference now is that our beacons no longer burn in the open air. They pulse in glass fibers, hum in satellites, and flicker behind screens. But the longing is eternal, to be seen, to be understood, to send our message into the dark and know it will be answered. The fire fell silent, but its spirit never died. It only changed its form. Echoes of light. The legacy in modern communication. There is a strange poetry in the way knowledge survives. Even when its tools vanish, its essence lingers hidden in new inventions, disguised in modern language, but alive. The beacon towers may have turned to dust, their fires long extinguished, yet their spirit flickers quietly in every light we now send through the world. The story of modern communication, in truth, begins with those ancient fires, the first deliberate, human-made bridges between distant minds. When the last of the old beacons fell silent, the idea behind them did not die. It simply transformed. The flame became spark, the smoke became signal, and the tower became wire. What had once been a language of light carried across open skies was reborn in hidden networks of metal, glass, and energy. The beacons taught humanity that connection across distance was possible, that information could travel faster than footsteps, that sight could transcend the horizon. This realization, once learned, could never be forgotten. In the early 19th century, the age of electricity dawned. Inventors and dreamers rediscovered the same truth the ancient watchers had known, that the world could be bound together by light. But now, the light was invisible. In the wires of the telegraph it moved not as flame, but as current. Samuel Morse, who first turned electrical impulses into language, understood instinctively what those old towers had done. His dots and dashes, though coded differently, echoed the same rhythm, a pattern of presence and absence, light and dark, signal and silence. The message of a telegraph line was nothing more than a controlled pulse, a spark shaped into meaning, a fire of a new kind. Across continents, stations were built like modern beacons. Operators waited, hands poised on brass keys, ready to answer a call from far away. The old watchers had looked to the horizon. Now, they listened to the hum of wires. But the feeling was the same, that quiet anticipation of distant voices, the joy of connection, the gravity of responsibility. A misread spark could mean disaster. A well-timed signal could save lives. Just like the fire towers of the past, the telegraph turned the world into a single, breathing network. Messages that once took weeks by horse now traveled in minutes. Governments, armies, lovers, and merchants all used this new system to send their thoughts across unimaginable distances. The age of the beacon had returned, not upon the mountains, but through the veins of the earth. But the story did not stop there. For once light had been mastered in one form, humanity sought to refine it further. The next great leap came when light itself, not just electricity, was tamed. In the 19th century, the heliograph reappeared in military and scientific use. It was, in essence, a polished mirror that reflected sunlight in flashes, the purest descendant of the ancient beacon, used in deserts, on ships, and across mountains. The heliograph could send coded light signals over dozens of miles. It was simple, portable, and utterly reliant on the same principle that had guided watchmen in China and Greece. The line of sight, a clear horizon, a steady hand, and light itself became the medium once again. The heliograph brought the ancient art full circle. The old watchers, could they have seen it, would have recognized the geometry, the patience, the rhythm. Only now, the fire was clean, and the language was precise. During the late 1800s, armies in India, Africa, and the American West used heliographs to coordinate across vast, empty lands. The British Empire's communication networks, stretched thin across colonies, often relied on these devices. Some officers even called them the modern beacon fires. The heliograph was, in many ways, the last breath of the ancient method, sunlight instead of smoke, code instead of guesswork, mirrors instead of towers. But soon, even this elegant simplicity would give way to something greater. At the dawn of the 20th century, a young world was learning to speak through the air itself. Radio waves, discovered by physicists like Hertz and turned to practical use by inventors like Marconi, carried the dream of long-distance light even further. Now, no tower needed to see another. The horizon no longer limited human connection. Messages could leap invisibly across oceans, mountains, and continents. The invisible beacon had arrived, and though it was new, its soul was ancient. Radio communication, at its heart, is still the manipulation of waves, patterns of energy turned into meaning. Just as the old watchers once shaped smoke into symbols, so too did radio operators shape sound into language. They waited in silence for signals from the dark dots and dashes, beeps and pauses, the Morse code of the modern world. When the Titanic sank in 19, its desperate distress calls were not so different from the beacons of a burning tower. Flares lit the sky, radio waves filled the air, two languages of light, one ancient, one new, both crying for help across the abyss. Humanity, as always, spoke in fire and signal when words failed. Then came the light once more, refined, captured, and guided through glass. In the late 20th century, the development of fiber optics returned light to its original throne as the medium of connection. Within strands thinner than a hair, pulses of light now travel vast distances, carrying the weight of human thought, emotion, and memory. A single second of data transmission through a modern cable holds more information than all the fires ever burned across the Great Wall. And yet, at its core, it is still a chain of beacons, each relay passing the light to the next. In an endless dance of illumination, our world is now wrapped in these invisible threads, oceans crossed by undersea cables, cities linked by lasers, satellites flashing like high-altitude watch. The modern sentinel no longer tends a flame on a windy hill. He monitors the pulse of photons through machines, but he serves the same purpose: to keep the light moving, to keep the message alive. The echoes of the old beacons are not just technological, they are emotional, symbolic, even spiritual. In the old days, a beacon fire was a sign of vigilance, of life on the horizon. It meant someone was watching, someone cared enough to send a signal. That sense of connection, the comfort of knowing another mind is out there, is still the heart of modern communication. When we send a text, an email, or a live video, we are doing what the watchers did, sending proof of our presence. A spark in the darkness, a simple message that says, "I am here." The continuity is beautiful. Our ancestors stared into the same night sky, waiting for an answering flame. We stare into screens, waiting for a small blue light or a message tone. The substance has changed, the meaning has not. Even our metaphors keep the memory alive. We still speak of signals and networks, of beacons and lights. A beacon of hope remains one of humanity's most enduring phrases, the idea that light, wherever it appears, carries meaning, guidance, and safety. In lighthouses, in emergency flares, in the glow of our cities, the ancient language still whispers beneath the surface. When the first undersea telegraph cables were laid in the 1850s, some writers described them as threads of fire connecting nations. When the first satellites went up in the 1960s, the world called them watchers in the sky. Every generation, it seems, rediscovers the same image, the flame that binds us, and it is not just a poetic inheritance. It is a psychological one. The beacon fulfilled a primal need to know we are not alone. That need has followed us through every stage of progress, whether through fire, electricity, or data. Our greatest technologies are built not for power, but for connection. Today, the modern world burns with billions of tiny beacons, phones, routers, servers, satellites. Each sends out signals in light or radio, invisible yet constant. Together, they form a new great wall, not of stone and fire, but of communication itself. A digital fortification that surrounds the planet, watching, warning, connecting, and yet, for all our speed, we still echo the patience of those old watchers. The principles remain eternal: clarity, precision, timing, and trust. Whether you're lighting a beacon or sending a file, the challenge is the same: to be seen clearly through the noise of distance. The world has changed, but the language of connection has not. It is still light, in one form or another. Sometimes, when astronauts in orbit look down upon the Earth, they see the glow of cities like a string of fires across the darkness. The image is eerily familiar, a chain of light stretching over mountains and plains, each one answering the other. Humanity, still sending messages into the void. The same ancient rhythm, only now seen from the heavens. It is tempting to imagine that, in those moments, the Earth itself becomes a kind of beacon, a glowing world speaking silently into the universe, waiting for a response from distant stars. Perhaps one day our signals will be answered, and when they are, the message will be the same as it was millennia ago. We are here, we are watching. We have built our fires in the dark. The beacons of the past are not dead history. They are the ancestors of our networks, the grandparents of our satellites, the ancient pulse still beating in our global web of light. Each invention that came after, telegraph, radio, fiber optics, internet, carries within it a whisper of smoke, a flicker of the old fire, a trace of those lonely towers on the edge of empires. The watchers are gone, but their legacy burns quietly within every signal that crosses the world. For as long as light endures, their story continues. the eternal watchfire, humanity's need to, connecting every age, through every empire and every silence between them. Humanity has returned to one ancient instinct to send a message into the dark. Whether it was smoke rising from a tower, a torch blazing on a hill, or a quiet signal pulsing through glass and sky, the desire has never changed. It is the same yearning that beats beneath our inventions, our sciences, our art, the need to be seen, to be heard, to be known. From the first fire lit by trembling hands on some forgotten frontier to the silent hum of satellites orbiting far above the world, there runs a single, unbroken thread of light. It is the story of us. Long before history wrote itself in ink, our ancestors carved it in flame. When they first learned to control fire, they gained not only warmth and safety, but expression. The flickering glow became a kind of speech. It could welcome or warn, comfort or call. In that moment, humanity learned that communication was not only about words, it was about presence. When a torch burned on a hill, it said, "Someone is here." When a second torch answered, it said, "And I see you." That exchange, two lights recognizing each other across the void, was the first true conversation, and from that simple, wordless moment grew everything that followed. Signal towers, telegraphs, radios, fiber optics, and now the global web of light that never sleeps. Every spark since then has been an echo of that first ancient dialogue. There is something deeply human about the act of lighting a signal. It is both fragile and defiant, a small flame raised against vastness. It declares belief in connection even when distance seems too great. When darkness feels absolute, the watchers of old lived by that belief. Night after night, they climbed the cold steps of their towers, carrying torches through the wind. Their task was thankless, their world isolated. Yet still, they tended the fire. They believed that their light would be seen, that their message would matter. Sometimes, that faith was all they had. It is easy to forget, in our world of instant messages and glowing screens, that this simple act, sending light into darkness, was once an act of courage. A lonely man lighting a beacon on a distant wall may not have known if anyone was still alive beyond the hills. But he lit it anyway, because not to send a signal was worse than silence, it was surrender. And so, the ancient beacons were not merely tools of communication, they were acts of hope. In the centuries that followed, that hope never truly died. It changed its form, adapting to new ages. The fires became wires. The wires became light again, focused now through glass and laser instead of torch and oil. But the principle remained the same. One signal calls, another responds. Our entire civilization is built upon that rhythm. Cities, nations, even relationships all depend upon the same quiet trust, that what we send will be received, that our voices will find their way through the static of the world. Modern life, in all its complexity, is still a chorus of beacons. Every phone, every satellite, every screen, each one a point of light in the darkness, each one whispering across impossible distances. In a sense, the earth itself has become a colossal beacon, glowing with electric fire, pulsing with invisible signals, reaching ever outward. And what are we saying? What message are we sending into the cosmos? The same one our ancestors sent from their watchtowers. We are here. The ancient watchers might not recognize our tools, but they would recognize our hearts. They too felt the anxiety of silence, the fear of disconnection, the thrill of seeing and answering light. The same emotions that move through a message notification or a distant voice call once flickered in their firelit faces. Connection, in all ages, has been the medicine for loneliness. The proof that we exist, not in isolation but in relation. The beacons of old healed that loneliness, if only for a moment, by turning emptiness into a dialogue of light. And in our own time, every act of communication, every text, every video, every radio wave continues that ancient ritual. Technology has changed, but longing has not. Sometimes, progress feels like distance. We have filled the air with signals, yet many feel more alone than ever. Our networks are vast, but our silences are deep. The watchers of the past, sitting by their solitary flames, might look upon our world with wonder, but perhaps also with recognition, for they too knew the cost of vigilance. They, too, waited in the quiet, unsure if anyone would answer. There is something timeless in that waiting, in the human heart's endurance, in its refusal to give up the hope of being seen. Perhaps that is why the image of the beacon still moves us. It appears in our literature, our films, our prayers. It is the symbol of guidance, of warning, of life. A lighthouse on the sea, a candle in a window, a lantern carried through a storm. The forms differ, but the meaning endures. That light, in its simplest form, is the oldest language of hope. When Tolkien wrote of the beacons of Gondor, lighting across the mountains, it resonated because it touched something ancient, something that belonged not to fiction, but to memory. We all carry the image of that chain of flames inside us, even if we've never seen it. It feels familiar because it is ours, a relic of the collective past. In a sense, we are all watchkeepers now. Each of us tends a small flame, a digital signal, a word, a gesture, and sends it into the vast night of the modern world. We wait for replies. We hope to be understood. We hope that what we send matters. And though our towers are made of glass and wire instead of stone, our purpose is no different. We are still guarding the same truth the ancient watchers once protected, that connection is survival, that to communicate is to exist. The fire may have changed its color, but it still burns for the same reason. There is also a quiet warning in the old story, a reminder of what happens when the beacons fall silent. Empires fell when their towers went dark. Messages that were not sent, or were misunderstood, led to ruin. Communication, fragile, fleeting, has always been the thread that keeps civilization from unraveling. When we forget that, when we stop tending our fires, whether they are literal or emotional, darkness returns. That is why the tale of the ancient beacons remains so powerful. It teaches us that technology alone cannot preserve connection. The flame matters only if someone keeps it alive. The system works only if there is trust between those who send and those who receive. Without faith, even the brightest light is meaningless. In the quiet moments of our modern lives, when we see the glow of a phone screen in a dark room, or a distant city shining across the horizon, we are seeing reflections of the same ancient signal. The form has evolved, but the message has never changed. You are not alone. I am here. That is the eternal watchfire. It burns in every generation, through every invention. It burns in every human heart that reaches beyond itself. And maybe, somewhere in the future, when our species reaches beyond this world, that fire will still lead the way. When the first human settlement sends its signal from Mars, a beam of light across the black, it will not just be a technical achievement. It will be an ancient gesture, a continuation of that first torch lifted on a mountain long ago. For even among the stars, we will still be watchers, tending our flames, hoping for an answering light. The beacons may have gone out on Earth, but the human story is one of eternal relighting. Each age invents its own fire, its own language of connection, and every generation, no matter how advanced, repeats the same simple act. It sends light into darkness and waits. That is our oldest ritual, the proof that, though time and empires pass, the heart of humanity endures. The eternal watchfire burns still. As the final flames fade into the night, we're left with a thought that perhaps the light we see in the sky, or the glow of a screen before sleep, is not so different from those ancient fires. Each spark still carries a message. Each glow still says, "You are not alone." The watchtowers may have fallen, but the watchers never disappeared. We have simply traded fire for signal, and the message, for all time, remains the same. Thank you for watching Boring History for Sleeping. If this story brought you calm, light, or wonder, stay with us for the next quiet chapter of forgotten humanity. Until then, keep your own light burning,